This episode is brought to you by Element Electrolytes. Nsima, my man.
Mm-hmm.
How do you drink your Element?
So, I use it every morning when I do wake up because you sweat a lot when you sleep. So when you wake up, you want to rehydrate. But the big thing is that a lot of athletes, when they sweat during their workouts, you lose a lot of sodium, you lose a lot of salt. A lot of athletes talk about cramping up or feeling fatigued when they work out, especially if, let's say that you don't always eat before you work out, or maybe you're an athlete that does a little bit of fasting here and there. You will sweat a lot during your workout, and you want to make sure that you're adequately hydrated while training. This doesn't mean just drinking water. This means that you want to add electrolytes to whatever you're drinking so that you can rehydrate adequately to make sure you perform at a high level. It makes a big difference. Before, when I didn't used to take electrolytes, I used to cramp up a lot during workouts, and workouts were hit and miss. Some workouts I felt stronger, some workouts I felt weaker. But now, since I'm always adequately electrolyte hydrated pretty much. All my workouts feel great. I don't cramp up at all anymore. And it feels pretty damn good. So for me, on average, I think I'd go through about 2 to 3 Element electrolytes per day. And on long hikes, because I like to take long hikes, I could go through 5 or 6.
Does it feel like almost like a secret you have against all the other people that you're rolling with at jiu-jitsu? It
does make a difference because like a lot of people, again, you sweat a lot. Right. So people are like, oh, why am I cramping up? Well, you're potassium deficient, right? It makes a very, very, very big difference. So even though I do a lot of fasted training, I don't feel fatigued. I don't feel tired. I can get through every training session feeling amazing.
That's awesome. So if you guys want to get an edge on the competition like Nsima does, head over to drinklmnt.com/powerproject. Check out the value bundles. That's paying for 3 boxes, any flavor you guys want, and getting a 4th one free. Although we're going to tell you, you should definitely load up on the new watermelon and salt flavor. You see what I mean?
It's so good.
That thing is incredible. Can't recommend it enough. Again, drinklmnt.com/powerproject. Head over there right now.
I know you have a tendency to yell and scream and get crazy.
Let the emotions get to him.
Gets flustered very easily.
Oh, yes.
Cool.
Extremely volatile emotionally.
And violent. Very violent.
Oh, no.
Violent outbursts. Difficult to predict when it'll happen.
Are we on air?
Yeah, we're on now.
I'm actually curious, James, because you definitely know all those different tests that can tell you how volatile you are within the range and how neurotic you are. Are there any out there that you think are even accurate? Because of if you're, are there any out there that you think are accurate?
It's a good question. I think the way that I would answer that is by considering whether one recognizes accuracy as being localized to the conditions under which such a test are administered. Meaning, the psychological interpretation of the test environment itself has to be included in the outcome of such an evaluation. Like, let's say you have someone who has what's referred to as the white coat syndrome, where any medical diagnostic situation is something that is an anxiety-inducing circumstance, which is obviously solved for by reinterpretation. But for someone who does not have that knowledge, then invariably that has something to do with their responses during such. It's difficult. The reality is it's difficult to perform diagnostic testing in that domain in ways that map universally onto the life experience. And so I think what would be the future of maybe a more effective type of assessment would be some type of artificial intelligence capture that could non-invasively track someone. I use the word non-invasively, not speaking specifically about something internalized within the human body, but if you could imagine that eye in the sky existing, and you're not aware that it's there.
Yeah.
It's just something that's monitoring you over the course of days, weeks, to capture your behavior in the environment in which you operate. And then have a panel of knowledgeable minds evaluate what you're seeing in that domain, because that domain is your life. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to maybe just observe yourself, right? So if you're taking like some online test to kind of see what your personality type is or any of those variables, it would be really, might be challenging to observe your own behaviors, right?
It's difficult for most people to disassociate the way that they want to be or want to be perceived from their best attempt at objectively describing the way they are. That's a big issue with those types of self-assessments, that it's a lot of work for most people not to project some version of themselves into the answers as opposed to what's really happening. And it's also, in a sense, a difficult prospect, because if you could imagine someone who knows you more than anyone else, and how might their responses to the same questions align or diverge from your own, which brings to bear another set of considerations in terms of what's the differential between the internal dialogue, the thoughts, etc., versus what is outwardly observable.
I'm excited to dive into this topic because we just hear a lot of people talking about how they are stressed or due to X circumstances over the last 2 years or year and a half, however long it's been. You know, some people is saying that they gained a bunch of weight because the circumstances were harder because of the various news that they were hearing. It was stuff that they kind of felt that was heavy, that was dragging them down or slowing them down, or made it, you know, more difficult to maybe exercise the way that they're used to. And a lot of your research and a lot of the information that you've been sharing and this new app that you've worked on is to assist with being, I guess, psychologically resilient and building immunity to stress. And in my own sharing of some of the information you've shared with me in trying to assist people to kind of get back on track with certain things, when I sometimes say that you can build immunity towards stress, they kind of say, no, you can't. Or they'll say, easy for you to say. And they could point out, they'll say, oh, would be easy for you to say because you're wealthy, or easy for you to say because you're already fit, or easy. You know, they kind of throw out another thing, you know, towards that on why maybe I'm not stressed, but why their life is so difficult. How do you share with people a helpful way that they can recognize and start to maybe take steps in the right direction to be immune to stress or build immunity to stress?
By first explaining in a hard to vary way what stress is. Let's agree on a definition. And my preferred definition of stress is some fact of reality, which is not limited to that which is external to the human body. It can be thoughts that you're having, anything that we could convince someone else happened or exists. Some fact that is negatively interpreted. That's what stress is. It is the negative interpretation of something, an idea, person, place, thing, event. And the way to become immune to that is to modify how one interprets the world. So in effect, stress immunity is a accessible phrase. No one's, particularly a native English speaker, is unclear about what that means in general, when in fact, if we dig down on, well, what does that actually mean? It is the reinterpretation of the world as one navigates it. And when you think critically about that, that's what one has to accept as being a strong explanation. That when anybody reflects on what it is that they're currently or have previously reacted to that has resulted in what they would describe as stress or being stressful, that individual must admit that whatever that thing is or was a real thing. I use the word real loosely. It can include a thought that they had, even if it's by any objective measure an irrational thought. We can agree, okay, I believe you, you had that thought, and then your interpretation of it is what resulted in this heightened level of neuroticism, anxiety, worry, concern, anger, whatever it is. And that individual has to admit that, okay, James, I accept your explanation as being closer to the truth, that it was in fact a thing that happened, say, and then it's the way I interpreted that thing. That's why I'm feeling the way that I'm feeling. Everyone must admit that. There's no exception to that. In this, as I said, it includes what's happening internally. Someone could have a congenital, sort of a hereditary predisposition, say, for general anxiety, and so it can go back a long way with them. What they would recognize as the physical sensation of anxiety. All the neurobiologists, neuroscientists, et cetera, out there understand, well, what they're feeling is probably epinephrine that's been released into the system, and maybe that cascaded into cortisol being released from the HPA axis, et cetera. There's a technical description of the mechanism, not only for anxiety, but for any emotion, and why anybody would explain the physical sensation of a given emotion. So say anxiety in the people who deal with that, which is many people, would have some similar description that centers around, well, maybe it's tightness in the chest or sweat, clammy palms or elevated heart rate as the physical sensation. And what must be understood is that physical sensation is a process of neurobiological, neurophysiological events that are triggered as a result of an interpretation. You remember we were having this conversation yesterday that interpretation bookends both part of it. So it starts the process of any emotion, and it comes in at the other end of it, in which case the conscious recognition of what's happening internally involves an interpretation.
I think an easy example of this might be a relationship. Somebody could say, when I was in that relationship with that person, and we can talk about the made part later, but when I was in that relationship, that girl really made me mad or really made me sad. What happens when you're no longer with that girl and you're perhaps maybe with somebody else? You probably don't care any longer about what that girl is saying about you, because you swapped out ideas. You swapped out your, as you call it, I believe, value assignment. You placed a high value assignment on this particular person. Can you speak upon that a little bit further? I have another example too I want to bring up, but go ahead.
Yes. Value is a close relation to significance. What we attach it to is either a conscious or an unconscious process. That's the explanation for a lot of strong emotional reactions, the value that has been assigned and how the associations with that value have been essentially cascaded into how an individual would be described, the nature of their emotions that are associated with it. And as you just referenced, that's one of the examples that I like to use. Anyone, male, female, whatever, that has been in a previous romantic relationship that they're no longer in can reflect on how that value changed. That presumably at the beginning of the relationship, it was strongly assigned, which explains, say, the positive emotions that are remembered from that time at the beginning. And let's say that it ended how they would describe as badly, and they hold that former partner in low favor. They have a low opinion of them. The value assignment has changed. And the same is true, sort of generalizing now into how this works. I like to use the examples of different types of sports implements, a baseball, an American football, a hockey stick, etc., which anyone knows who's familiar with those sports, say in the Western world, at a garage sale in the US, at a yard sale, anybody knows a few bucks gets you a baseball, an American football, a hockey stick. And anybody who has a reasonable affinity for sports recognizes that that same few dollar ball or puck or stick or whatever that was purchased for a few bucks, if you get Tom Brady or Jaromir Jagr or Larry Fitzgerald, or to go down the list of whatever sports your favorite players are, to sign that thing that you bought for a few bucks, someone out there is going to pay 100, 1,000, 10,000, 1,000,000 times the amount you paid, because they're convinced a certain person signed their signature on it. It's this arbitrary notion of value. In, the market value of the item on its own is a few bucks. And then in certain contexts, only if you have that value assigned to it, might you at the same time recognize, I know that thing was only purchased for a few bucks, but because it's got his or her signature on it, I'm willing to pay this. Whereas someone who does not place that value on sport or that athlete, it doesn't matter that the signature is on it. It's a few bucks. I don't care who signed it. What kind of a rational person would, it's value. And value is another one of these properties that is malleable. Any individual has the capacity to unassign what they've assigned in terms of value. And that's an important truth to recognize, because that's one of the features of reprogramming how we interpret the world.
Do you demote people? Do you devalue the value assignment that you had previously so you don't get hurt? Or how does, like with your dad or your mom or your brother or someone that you care about?
I describe the psychological reserve. And anyone who fully assimilates the space of possibilities is a person who doesn't have to demote or devalue.
I see.
It's a different way of looking at the world, in that anyone who commits to fully endeavoring to come to terms with what is not defied by the laws of physics, which encapsulates an enormous set of possibilities, is a person who has a much more balanced view of the world, having come to terms with what, no matter how unlikely, is possible. And therefore, anything that can happen, in the unlikely event that it does happen, you're already that much more well equipped to navigate that circumstance.
Like, for example, everybody that you know currently has the ability to die.
Correct.
Just understanding that that is a possibility. It can happen. Car accident, plane accident, whatever it might be. That's been really helpful for me. I've had many friends die. I've had many family members die, and kind of just walking myself through, what would that be like? And even having conversations with my dad, who's still alive. He actually almost died a couple times a couple years ago. But I think at this point he's indestructible. But in communicating with him, just even talking to him very openly about what it will look like when he's gone, and him talking about just kind of what to do, like what the actions would be. And it actually just, it'll be, regardless of our conversations about it, I love him very much. He's like an idol to me, and my value assignment for him is through the roof. And so, his passing will be something that will be, I'm definitely not going to be immune to crying about it, and not going to be immune to having some emotions for it and about it. However, just because I'm maybe sad or upset, it doesn't still have to be, there's really no reason for it to be negative. It can still be, hey, like I had an awesome dad. I had an amazing time with him. He showed me a lot of stuff. He showed me how to be a man. He showed me how to live my life. He taught me a lot of great things, and they don't have to necessarily be tears of sadness. They could be tears of happiness, because I'm grateful that I had that guy around for as many years as I have.
And any other interpretation you can think of. Yes, that what you described as an example. So let's generalize, so we're not using your living father as the example. That take that as a fact. I don't know what the statistic is. People are dying every few seconds in the country and the world, and that's a fact. And at the moment in which an individual dies in whom value has been assigned by anyone else, there's an interpretation to be made. And you mentioned one. Another, amongst the near infinite amount that are accessible, could be what happened exists within the space of possibilities. I have the choice how to interpret it. I could choose to celebrate the life that was lived. I could choose to grieve the life that was lost. I could choose to be indifferent, because this is just something that is in the space of possibilities. And we could go on and on and on and on with I could choose and then fill in the blank. I encourage anyone to think critically about first recognizing whether you're persuaded or not to agree or disagree that you get to choose. There's no such thing as, oh, well, grief is automatic, or, oh, well, anger is automatic, or, oh, well, indifference is natural, it's automatic. What is automatic is what each one of us has conditioned ourselves as that navigational tool. That's what's automatic for that person. And regardless of what anyone has made automatic, that can be changed. I'm reminded of the quote from one of the most cited researchers in the field of behavioral genetics, Robert Plomin, states that behavioral genetics explains what is, not what could be, which is important to recognize that even if we're referring to someone, I mentioned the anxiety as having been inherited, even if we're talking about someone that has an expression of behavior that is directly attributable to genes that they inherited from a progenitor, on the other end of the spectrum, someone in whom the behavioral expression is entirely environmentally, in terms of an epigenetic influence, something that they encountered in their life that they did not have a inherited explanation, but nevertheless, their behavior has changed as a result of what happened in their living experience. It doesn't matter what is most important to recognize is that no matter the situation that explains what is, that the way navigating the path forward and that in the way that's most helpful for that individual is by recognizing something you said earlier. All of this is explainable in the practical way at the level of ideas. Because again, even the neurobiological mechanism of why one emotion feels physically than a different one has to be recognized as part of the equation. What must precede that understanding is that which triggers, for instance, the release of certain neurotransmitters that lead to the cascade of events that we might describe as why joy feels physically different than sadness. So there's the neurobiology of that, of, well, this is why that feels differently because you've interpreted that physical sensation with either a positive association or a negative association. The key is understanding what comes first in the order. Interpretation happens first, and it happens last, because as I stated earlier, it's an interpretation that triggers the whatever feeling an individual describes, including all the possibilities from someone dying. And it's another interpretation that determines how that, say, initial feeling, which is a product of an interpretation, is interpreted thereafter. So due to social conditioning and social norms, etc., cultural influences, complicated discussion regarding all that contributes to what makes Nsima and Mark and James different from one another. It's not a short answer. However, that which determines our behaviors moving forward can, if we so chose, Andrew, you're included in this, is something we could agree upon and unify, just based upon a collective agreement and collaboration that this is the way we're going to be. This is the way we're going to navigate the world from this point forward. So it's important to understand what is within the dominion of any individual and why I consider that to be a superpower, because when you fully accept it, you realize that it doesn't matter what happens, that you have the agency to interpret that which has happened in a way that is helpful. And that's simply a choice that anybody can make.
When we were listening to your app earlier, something, I think both Mark and I wrote this down, but you said negative emotion is masochistic. And when I heard that, I was like, damn, because I've heard a lot of individuals I know say like, oh, she made me feel this way, or he did this and he made me feel this way. And everything you're saying currently, we have to realize that literally the way that we feel about something, no matter what somebody has done, and maybe it did affect us, the way we choose to feel, like if we have a negative emotion, that is our choice, right?
You're correct.
So can you kind of go into that idea of negative emotion being masochistic? Because so many people are probably listening like, I feel these things all the time. I'm not choosing this. This is happening to me.
I don't like pain and stress.
I don't like it. It's not like I'm choosing to do this to myself, but it's continuously happening. And like people are probably listening like, how the fuck do I just make this stop?
Yes.
Right?
I guess it's important to point out you're also talking about healthy brains, right? Like, I mean, there's some people that may have disorders that may have absolutely, they might not have the same level of control, is it right?
That's correct. That there has to be the differentiation between what you just said was spot on, the level of control. So while some of what I share is hypothesis, some is more theory, some is consensus, what must be recognized is that even in those extreme cases, something in terms of, say, a hereditary schizoid affective disorder, bipolar, where there are currently knowledge has not been created yet that can solve for those conditions. At present day, all that can be done is to mitigate symptoms, to manage. That being said, this significance of interpretation does not lose its efficacy. It's just that the degree to which it could have transformative potential at present day is probably less than in someone who is not dealing with such a disadvantage. So regarding anyone who is not, well, actually, I'll just leave that open, and because someone might be listening who has a clinical diagnosis of schizoid affective disorder, for example, and what that individual can do is they can make their own choice as to the strength of my explanation. All inputs, sensory, must go through their own basal form of interpretation. So, when we go through the somatosensory network and let's just talk about the basics of, sight, sound, smell, taste, etc. That this sensory information is on a foundational level interpreted by the respective, seems to be the sort of the cutting edge of this type of scientific research these days, has mapped a more general network of the brain, whereas what more previously might have localized, okay, well, something you smell or taste has primarily been handled by what's referred to as the gustatory cortex, or what's being seen by the visual cortex, or what's being executed with physical actions in the motor cortex. Whereas I think those specific categorizations have been replaced by a more general interpretation of how there's more areas of the brain responsible for processing sensory information than it was previously localized regionally. Regardless, that sensory stimuli is interpreted on very basic levels, different from the way that we've been using the word interpretation so far, which involves cognition, cognitive thought, cognitive effort. The basic levels of interpretation, which any parent can see in a child who's processing the world around them, these basic interpretations are happening that are informing them, that are allowing them to improve their ability to navigate through space, etc., that are in part independent of knowledge creation. And I assume we'll get into this later, but for now, the sensory data that is interpreted on a basal level that explains, say, different types of physiological processes that are independent of our cognitive form of interpretation are eventually cognitively interpreted. And I say eventually, this could be in fractions of a second relative to the initial exposure. And it's simply important to recognize that once we get to the level of discussing the cognitive interpretation, the reference frame, the context, the perception that one draws, that's where the power resides. And it is at that point that determines everything that follows, such as emotional reactions. So anyone who exists on that end of the spectrum that you were speaking towards, who is struggling with stronger and more frequent episodes that derive from neuroticism, which is the seat of all negative emotion. So whether it's someone who has more anxiety or depression or anger or is worried and concerned about, etc., this can all be derived in what's referred to as the 5-factor model from neuroticism. And if we think of that spectrum. On one end is anchored down by neuroticism, and on the other end, equanimity. People who are farther away from equanimity, and I think we were discussing some of this earlier, are more likely to react to something that I would say. Sort of the best case might be, I heard what James described and it makes logical sense. However, it seems inaccessible for me.
I'm an emotional person.
Right. That's not unlike anyone who endeavors to improve in any skill area who is at the beginner level. Nsima, if we talk jiu-jitsu, the person's first day on the mat, never done it before. On top of that, no competitive sports history. So they're really starting at a baseline. And the resident high-level black belt just to show them the levels that exist, does his or her thing, and that person new to the gym is faced with an interpretation. Two common interpretations to discuss there. One person, that was amazing. This person who's 50 pounds lighter than me, I felt helpless. I couldn't do anything. Mm-hmm. This is incredible. I want to be able to do that. And they're there as frequently as they can be there for years hence. Another interpretation, the hell with this. And due to shame and frustration and anger, their first day was their last day. They don't return. I use that as an example regarding the psychological, in that someone, for whatever reason, and in fact, no matter where they are on that spectrum, but it's most likely that people who are closer to equanimity, who are less emotionally volatile, would be more similar to that individual who recognizes, this is awesome in the jiu-jitsu gym and wants to learn because it seems accessible. There's something that is within their grasp. Whereas that person who's more inclined to dismiss it, in part, their explanation for that is the distance they perceive, the time it will take, when in fact, the mechanism of every high-level black belt in jiu-jitsu, what they must agree upon was the consistency and the determination to keep going. And keep going can be elaborated upon each individual's sort of perception, the consistency.
One hold, one move, one practice, 1 minute, one...
Exactly.
One shitty practice, just like
yes,
at one after another, just whatever small amount you can devote to it, you got to figure out a way to do it as much as possible.
Same thing with you and the incredible barbell lifting achievements, and anyone else who's achieved a high level of skill in anything will agree the time that was required, the consistency, the dedication, the quality of what was done consistently, etc. And the same is true for the psychological domain, that it's true that if someone is, to use a parochial term, operating on the programming that is high in neuroticism and has convinced themselves that they're just an emotional person, or that this is just sort of something they have to accept about themselves, must recognize that in order to traverse that distance towards equanimity simply requires the same thing that everybody else has done in any other skill to reach the level of expertise. It's no different in principle. the type of, in this case, thinking exercises and what I just generally refer to as psychological preparation will simply take longer. I'm reminded of, the BJ Penns of the world who accelerated to the level of not just black belt, but competitive, objectively speaking, in a short amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing psychologically. There's individuals such as yourself, Mark, who speaking to Andy the other day, I said, I'm sure that there's childhood friends of yours, apart from your family, who would describe Mark was always sort of a cool cat in terms of, a mellow fellow. And so what that means is someone like yourself is inherently that much closer. But, and this would be your own thoughts that you would share on this. You could describe what was honed in on or optimized as a result of some of our discussions, given the fact that your starting level using the belts, like you were already a brown belt.
Oh, yeah. Well, the whole reason why I kind of went to you in the first place was not to deal with myself. It was to deal with other people, but I knew that I needed more knowledge, because I needed to be able to, certain things coming at you a certain way, not maybe sure of the correct words to communicate back to somebody about, what they could do about a particular situation. I had decent ideas, but like you said, I'm pretty calm. So if I said, well, this is how I'd handle it, they're thinking like, that's not what I said. Like I'm telling you that I'm frustrated with this other person, or I'm telling you this because I'm expecting you to resolve this, maybe perhaps go yell at the other person. They have an expectation of what they were looking for from me. So going to you and communicating with you was really useful in just me saying, me looking at things just, I guess, in a more factual way, and just kind of having a better understanding of there's a lot of different personalities in my life. There's a lot of people from different backgrounds, and they're going to sometimes not always align with each other. And I got to figure out a way to communicate to them that that's just the way it is. And I was able to do that effectively. I was able to go to people and really kind of like disintegrate the situation, make it completely almost dissolve or disappear. Maybe not all the way, but super close to it, by having what you refer to often as having a good explanation.
And that's the key, is that it begins with the explanation, and that must be married with the degree to which an individual is cognitively open or closed to entertaining it. Which means it doesn't matter how strong, which is to say, another David Deutsch lesson, hard to vary an explanation is. If one is not open to be persuaded, it's irrelevant. Sort of the great example here is the degree to which a Catholic and a Muslim are likely to be persuaded by one or the other hinges as much upon the strength of the explanation of the other as it does each individual's willingness to be persuaded. Regardless how strong that explanation is, if that Catholic individual is simply not open to considering anything else, it doesn't matter how strong the explanation is from the Muslim individual, vice versa. Generalize that to any other situation, that it's the strength of explanation and the willingness to be persuaded. Critically important.
As you're talking, it made me think, because Mark has mentioned that he's been kind of mellow, and even myself too. That's how, like, there weren't many times that I responded to things super angrily, or man, my mom gets pissed at me for this, but things don't really seem to hit me even though they should. And that used to bother her quite a bit. So like, I haven't heard much of your app, but it's why that I vibe towards stoicism a lot. And I read a lot about that over the years. And I was like, I dig this, because I was already like, that was already something I was trying to get to, a place where I could control my emotions. But, you know, what I was trying to think about is like, for an individual who thinks that they're static or they can't change, or people don't change, and also an individual who maybe they're farther off of the scale, right? So they are more emotionally reactive. How can they even get to a place where they're like, this makes sense? Like, this is something that I want to be able to do. And it again brought me back to what you mentioned about negative emotions being masochistic, because if we think about it, when has massive levels of emotional reactivity or negative emotions served us positively? Like, I can't remember a time in my life that me getting super angry at something or somebody and like reacting angrily, or having massive levels of debilitating sadness, has ever ended up with a positive outcome. And I think if an individual is listening and, like, let's say they are super emotionally reactive, if you ask yourself that and you really think about any time that you've been super angry, super sad, super whatever, has it actually served you?
Brilliant. And for all the evolutionary biologists out there who are standing up and getting ready to scream due to their unhelpful interpretation of what you just said, what deserves to be clarified there is there's an evolutionary explanation for why we have emotions. And it's in almost all cases, specifically regarding what would be conjectured to be the emotional spectrum as it existed millennia ago, is directly attributable to enhancing our survival rate. So what anyone can imagine is, prior to the advent of language in its sophisticated form as it exists today, if we go back far enough, much earlier than when the Stoics existed in the first era of 2,500 years ago, we can imagine a situation with some primitive type of language where that's the explanation for how these emotions developed, as the genes attempt at expressing the behavior of their meat packaged hosts, in the case of humans, to live at least until the age of procreation, so those genes could replicate themselves. You know, that's the only programming of the genes, is replication, replication, replication. And so through trial and error over the millennia, this is a strong explanation for the advent of emotional complexity in humans. And then the more these nomadic tribes interacted with each other and there was more social interaction, more emotional complexity development. And you can see how this served its purpose, but no longer has to have the same seat at the table given the knowledge. And there's sort of a microcosm of this in any family, where you look at the behavior of young children, yelling, screaming, temper tantrums. Those behaviors, there's an evolutionary explanation, and they do inform individuals in the presence. So even though that child who has either limited language or they're not speaking with the native language yet, there's still a range of emotional expression. I mean, there's emotional knowledge that we are born with. We enter the world with a certain amount of emotional knowledge, genetically inherited. And that is sufficient. That's why any mother, particularly those who are attentive mothers, will describe the differentiation between cries. Like, this cry means hungry. This means they need to be cleaned. This cry means the other thing. That, the more attentive the mother is, they become hyper-tuned. Again, there's an evolutionary explanation for that hyper-tuning. It enhances the survival of the offspring. So unquestionably, from the evolutionary biological space, emotion served an integral part of our survival that must some way exist in the explanation for why it was, Homo sapiens and not the Denisovians or the Neanderthals or the Cro-Magnon or whatever else that exists today as the dominant human species on the planet. However, my position is with the creation of knowledge, that's the answer for why we can navigate the world, not even as adults, but as young people, much more effectively than placing the emotional navigation system in the driver's seat. It's knowledge. We can imagine something like, how did the emotion of fear come to pass? I've thought about this. We know that all essentially organisms, let's say, I said organisms, let me modify that to, let me just say all animals, humans included, are born with some level of threat detection, not fear. Fear is learned. Threat detection is inborn.
Like a baby might walk up to or not a baby, but like a little kid might walk up to like an alligator or something, not have any idea that it's
exactly
hurtful, harmful.
Exactly.
If they're when they're just crawling towards it or something.
Right. It's just something big and curious, and the knowledge does not exist. So let's use that example. 500,000 years ago, two young humanoids, and one of them approaches a large reptile, not knowing, and that reptile attacks humanoid number one. And prior to dragging them in under the water, there's yelling and screaming and the rest. And so humanoid number two is looking at this and extrapolating in whatever degree of either emotional or cognitive empathy that they possess. There's some connection with like some version of not good, must not feel good, something along those lines. And you can imagine how the concept of fear developed. Perhaps it went from threat detection to fear. Who knows what the order was, but you can imagine the associations there. Not through some version of intellectual dialogue, but rather the genes' influence on behavioral expression. That fear for a period of time, and I say a period of time, this could have been hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, was directly linked to our ability to survive as a species, to avoid the precipice, to avoid the large predators, to develop weapons. No question, must have been integral to survival. However, when we get to the point in which the knowledge is created, we know that knowledge can replace that masochistic experience of being just, as one example only, riddled and operating on the basis of a fear-based worldview. That's why I use examples regarding there's no law that forces interpretation. I use the large predatory shark example, say a large great white shark. And if someone's swimming in whatever ocean or region of an ocean in which there are great whites present, whether this is areas of South Africa or Australia or along most of the coast of California and the northern Atlantic, that if you're swimming in an area in which we know that these animals frequent and a large dorsal fin appears and you're convinced that belongs to a great white shark, there's an interpretation to be made there. And someone who only knows fear is likely to panic. And that panic is likely to express itself either in a lack of motion, freezing, or frantic motion, which is more commonly perceived as panic, but either one of those can be expressions. And the interesting thing is that both of those reactions make that individual that much more appealing as a prey item for that large shark, who's not necessarily a man-eater at all, but just something that's hungry and attracted to motion or the ease at which it will be to dominate its prey. It's the law of the animal kingdom that the predators are never seeking as their first choice the strongest, the fastest, the fittest, the most capable. Never. It's the weakest, the slowest, the oldest, the youngest. Because the energetic resources required for that predator to secure that prey item, they're just conditioned to recognize that will cost less energy. And it's the reason why someone unknowing would take a pass on mugging any one of us, just based upon the visual interpretation. That looks like more work than I'm willing to do, not even knowing how capable each one of us is in a situation like that. And that unknowing person might be more likely to attempt to mug the person who weighs 100 pounds less than each one of us, not knowing whether they are a UFC fighter or a hand-to-hand expert or a black belt,
or a gun owner.
Or a gun owner. just on the assumption of that looks like less work. It's the law of the jungle. And it applies to humans equally well. It's rare that anyone in any part of the world would produce a news report of the 6'2", 230-pound jacked male that was mugged last night. It's just rare to find that. Why? Because those human predators that are seeking to pull one off on somebody are following the same practical laws. Like they're going after the slowest, the weakest, the smallest, the oldest. So going back to that shark analogy, what is helpful? To not interpret it negatively, to interpret it practically. Okay, large shark, probably not interested in eating me, but might be interested in doing a taste test. So how can I make myself least appealing? One answer would be to make yourself as big as you can, spreading the arms and legs underwater, and maybe even doing your best to yell underwater, to project capability and strength. And this can paint the illusion that you're bigger than you are for the sole purpose of just look less interesting to that animal, so that it thinks to itself, on its basic level of information processing, these laws of the animal kingdom, that looks like too much work. That's the most helpful thing you can do. Not freak out and pray to God and, oh my God, we're going to die, and negatively forecast all the painful ways that this could potentially go, but rather, let's see how disinterested we could make that shark.
What's the shortest distance back to the boat? You know, those types of things, right?
Right.
Any one of those options.
So we generalize that to any other situation in which someone might be fill in the blank, mortified, horrified, petrified, paralyzed with fear, anxiety, etc., and realize that is not helpful. What is helpful is navigating whatever situation that is that you've interpreted negatively in a way that is efficient. That could be an intruder in your home. It could be someone attempting to mug someone on the street. Anything, fill in the blank. Always what the most helpful reaction is, the one that allows that individual to navigate the given situation the most efficiently. And so I use the word masochistic because it's a choice. Because interpretation is a choice, anyone who is frequently dealing with, it's not even frequently, anytime any one of us is dealing with a negative emotion, we're being masochistic because, consciously or not, we chose that interpretation that resulted in the negative emotion. And because it's a choice, that's why it's masochistic, because you can choose otherwise. And I state that, and again, we have to be specific because where more or less control enters the equation must be acknowledged. So regarding those populations of people who have more control to influence their choices and decision-making, it's that much more tractable. It's that much more feasible to recognize you have power over your thinking, your interpretations, not the thoughts, the random thoughts that enter your consciousness, but the intentionality of thinking. And within that lies the ability to create the knowledge in that person's mind that is necessary to recalibrate how they interpret either the world in general or those subject matters in particular that are most commonly existing at the root of their negative emotion by way of being negatively interpreted.
Why can't we see, like, why is it not so obvious? Like if I was, hitting a nail into a board and I smashed my thumb, it's like pretty obvious, like, that I kind of messed up and I hurt myself. But in this situation where we're maybe being masochistic with our choice to attach a particular negative emotion to a situation, how is it that we can't see it? Like, what when we're in the moment, when we're in the experience, how are we not seeing like the full picture of how we continue to choose these wrong interpretations over and over again?
It's a product of the disabling effects of negative emotion. Couple technical terms: relational and item-specific processing. That heightened negative emotion clouds judgment, clouds our ability to reason logically, and alternatively encourages the narrowing of our focus on the stimuli and associated trains of thought in that negative framework. It's called item-specific, tunnel vision, if you will. That if anybody considers an argument, an emotional-based argument, say with a significant other, which almost anyone who's ever been in a romantic relationship will have experience with, they will remember that in the heat of it, they were laser focused on that one thing. That thing that, say, represents why that person perceives they were on the right side of the exchange and the other person was on the wrong side.
It could be 1 month later that you totally forget why you even got into a fight with that person in the first place.
That's true too. However, in answering your question, like why can't you see it when it's happening, that's one of the properties of negative emotion, that it disables your ability to think clearly, literally. Item specific. So you're localized in on that, hyper-focused on that one thing, that source of the disagreement, or that reason one thinks they're in the right, or that explanation that they think absolves them, whatever it is. The other end of it is relational processing. This is seeing the big picture, the connections between things. And relational processing exists within anyone the closer they are to baseline. And in different contexts, what can be understood as an advantage would be, say, a heightened level of arousal in terms of sensory processing that could, for example, reduce reaction speed. So it's not that baseline is necessarily optimal for every situation. It's that we could make the generalization remaining relatively close to it. That's optimal, because there are situations in which being slightly aroused could be an advantage, say for decreasing reaction time in a given situation. The point is to recognize the differentiation between the two, and that anyone has the ability, again, speaking about those populations in whom the volitional control is at their access, is accessible to them, to modify how they interpret facts, events, things, circumstances in such a way that optimizes their clear thinking. As negative emotion escalates in its strength, the more disabled that individual is in reasoning. And again, there's neurobiological explanations for why that is true. A simple analogy is the relationship between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, which are two different parts of the brain that are principally responsible for opposing phenomenological experiences. So the amygdala is namely responsible for fear, negative emotional processing, and its outputs have influences over parts of the brain that release the catecholamines, the glucocorticoids that explain the feelings one associates with negative emotion. And the prefrontal cortex, much differently, is the seat of rationality, reasoning, logic, executive level functions and decision making, and they're connected by tissue. There's actually a tract of tissue that connects the two that explains the relationship between modes of processing reality and how many areas of our brain can be simultaneously responsible for that processing. And they act, using this example between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, somewhat similarly to a seesaw or a teeter-totter. When one's output is upregulated, the other's is suppressed. Therefore, anyone listening recognizes the most focused they have been, the most clear thinking, the most cognitively sharp in problem-solving mode would be memories that are absent of strong emotion. Similarly, anyone, whether or not someone is emotionally volatile, most individuals who are not, say, clinically being described as having anhedonia or some other feature that is just the absence of emotion, regardless if someone's volatile or not, everyone will have a, us included. Nsima, you've described yourself as being more of a mellow fellow. We know that Mark is. I am. However, all of us know the difference between being angry and being absent of anger. And anyone, again, regardless of where they are on that spectrum, can recognize that on the other end of the spectrum, some of the angriest they've been, they have been absent of clear and logical thinking. That's because of this teeter-totter or seesaw relationship that exists between the area of our brain, namely responsible for being reasonable and thinking clearly and logically, and the other area of our brain that describes sort of the seat of strong emotional expression, particularly that which is fear-based or related.
It was helpful for me to kind of recognize that some of my thoughts were irrational. Sometimes the way that you would explain stuff, I mean, you weren't like, hey, you're irrational. You had a lot of explanation, and you made a reference one time talking about being in the experience. And in this particular case, I got this like Bo Jackson rookie card right here, right? In this particular case, when you're in the experience, James explained, that you're holding the picture or painting. Like, let's say we went to a museum and we're looking at this, beautiful painting or picture, or in this case, I'm looking at this Bo Jackson rookie card. But when you're in the experience, you're so close to it that you literally can't see well. You can't see the whole picture. In order to see the whole picture, you'd have to take a couple steps back so you have a better point of view. And the other thing that was really helpful was to just be observable. Learn the ability to like drone yourself, like get a fucking camera up in the sky, and see if you can look down on yourself a little bit and have a perspective of what's going on. Like you were mentioning some of these feelings that someone might get, right? So let's say you're flipping through your phone and you see some news that you're interpreting as negative. Could be, insert whatever thing normally makes you mad. It could be a post on politics, or a post on the current situation that we're in, and it could sway you one way or the other under normal circumstances. But if you're observing yourself, you could say, "Oh, there's that little flutter, like that little thing that was about to, where I was about to choose being angry." And you can say, that's interesting. That's there. Okay. But what am I looking at? I'm looking at some post that someone made that you could start to kind of deconstruct the whole thing. You can look into it. You could examine it further, and you can kind of say, well, this is is this really useful? Is this helpful to me in this moment right now to be mad that someone made a post about Donald Trump or whatever it is? Like, is that a useful interpretation of that? Is it helpful to be sitting there at home just stewing and being angry, and then not only getting mad about it, but then commenting on it, and now sitting in it, and now clicking on it, and now watching a video about it, and further investigating it, and then I can't believe what this guy said, and then this guy, and then this other guy, and before you know it, because you're so close to the situation, 30 minutes went by and you're just sitting there having like a pity party for yourself, or getting yourself all worked up over really something that probably just didn't have to impact you that way.
And the degree to which an individual like that finds it accessible to transition themselves out of such a worldview goes back to the jiu-jitsu analogy or any other skill development scenario, in which the way out of there is the consistent and incremental and step-by-step progression to the types of thinking, generally thinking exercises that result in the creation of new neural circuitry that results in different modes of default thinking and behavior. There's many similarities between human brains and computers, but they are not analogs of each other. So the similarities only go so far. But I think it can be helpful for people conceptually to think about behavior as being largely programmed based, in terms of, in most situations, most people's behavior can be thought of as the programs they're running on the hardware of their brain. In order to modify and create new behaviors, we must create new programs. We must create new circuits. It's the previous circuits that, when they're triggered, say by neurotransmitters, that's what explains the default modes of the behaviors that are associated with those circuits. And in order to modify and change, we have to create new ones. What does it take to create new circuits? Repetitive exposure to that new, in this case, line of thinking, where if it's a physical skill that is expressed in, say, the learning the technical manipulation of a musical instrument or a sport, the thing that you're doing to create those circuits that will ultimately result in those actions becoming automatic, in this case, is just a physical thing. In the psychological domain, practically speaking, there's no physical price one pays, right? There's no overreaching. There's no deterioration of one's physiology. Simply requires that you dedicate some time to think, which everyone has. Because you can do this while you're driving, while you're walking the dog, while you're, walking from the car to the place of work, to the grocery store. Like any time one has to think for themselves is an opportunity to transform how they perceive the world. And as a result, their well-being. It's that incremental, step-like, consistent approach that anyone has done and must do to develop a high level of skill in anything. Same process. It's just that the contents of that process are, at least in the form of the type of ideas that I've generated, coming to terms with the understanding that explains why what is currently existing with an individual is currently existing, getting an understanding of, okay, now I understand why the way my default mode triggers me to behave in this situation is because of this. Okay, that makes sense. And now in order to evolve that, to modify it, to redirect it, it's important for me to, say, self-observe and reevaluate a situation in such a way that I can incrementally condition myself to respond differently. The same way that anybody has done the same thing, you've been doing it on the mat, right? You've been doing the same exact thing. It's just the expression of it comes in a unique physical form. But the mechanics of it is the exact same. That, and seemingly any technical flaw you've had in clearing an opponent's guard, let's say with a particular type of guard pass, any type of flaw that you may have conditioned yourself due to, say, maybe not enough technical oversight from an instructor. Maybe you've been going really hard with someone, say, here in the gym without the supervision of someone more knowledgeable. And obviously your physical tools will be superior to most of the people you'll be training with. And so it would be easy for you to rely upon those. Like you're going to have to, you recognize this, you'll have to work to not use your physical skills. And you can imagine how a bad habit could be developed, especially if you did not have someone staying on top of you. You used your strength there. Cheater, And so say that was pointed out, then you would realize, okay, I'm going to have to put that in my forebrain to remember not just to muscle my way through that pass. And I'm going to have to make that something I think actively about for enough repetitions until it becomes my new default mode.
So maybe his interpretation is the guy that he's working with is instead of 5'8", he's 6'8", and the guy that he's working with is 300 pounds instead of 200 pounds.
That's one way to look at it. Another way, sort of more in line with what I would just be describing, is you making the conscious intention to move this way as opposed to moving the way I've been moving. And it could be subtle. It could be a slight different position of the hip, knee, elbow, depending upon what the pass was. But you can apply this to any circumstance. In a weight training activity, you could think about, it's been pointed out to me and I've seen myself on video and I recognize, in fact, I am doing, say, this with my right elbow. I know I need to do that with my right elbow. So what that means is you need to reduce the intensity and think about your right elbow every rep. Think about it every rep and not exceed the intensity that forces you to compromise that. That's where the intensity discussion comes in. I think you've
talked about that before. You train like that, right?
I use less physical force because I know that it's unnecessary. It's not going to serve me, especially if I'm working with somebody who I outweigh by 50, 70 pounds. I could probably get away with things by Hulk smashing them,
right?
But that wouldn't be beneficial for when I actually compete against somebody in my weight class. who maybe they have the same level of technique as me, right? It's not going to work. So I need to ease off of the force that I produce on anybody that I roll with pretty much and just try to let things flow.
And the key, using the jiu-jitsu example, is marrying the harmonious development of the physical resources you have with the technical expression.
Mm-hmm.
Because the perfect storm at whatever weight class is the individual who is highly technically proficient and can manifest a great deal of force in those positions.
Mm-hmm.
That's a person who's very difficult to overcome. And so it's that balanced utilization of resources, just like the same in the psychological domain, that using the same step-like approach to not exposing yourself to situations in which the intensity almost forces you, even though literally that's not what's happening, to use the default mode. There's a term in psychological therapeutic domains called exposure therapy, which is effective for obvious reasons if it follows an incremental approach, such as what we're just speaking about. Because say someone is struggling with, say, arachnophobia, where they're terrified of spiders. Exposure therapy would involve exposing them to spiders. But as we know, there's a lot of levels in how that could occur. Same thing, just in the interest of being consistent. There's a difference between you, Nsima, thinking about this approach of skill development as it regards jiu-jitsu. There's a difference between, say, recognizing if you're rolling with a high-level black belt who's 240 pounds and fit, not an obese 240, but a very high force producing in those specific jiu-jitsu actions individual, you trying to muscle that person is just going to be used against you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we say, okay, that's a great way to keep you honest because you cannot muscle that individual. However, we have to talk about the specifics about how those rolling sessions are being handled. What would not be helpful is if, say, I'm consulting on that situation and I'm talking to the black belt. What would not be helpful if I said, smash him. Do not hold back. Put him in his place. That would not be helpful to you, because the level of overload you'd be dealing with would be beyond your ability to effectively navigate in a step-like fashion.
Mm-hmm.
It would always just kind of be overwhelming. And even if you had the psychological position where you were never dissuaded by that, you would just look at it as sort of time wasted. On the other hand, let's say with that individual, I said, I want you to operate at an intensity of action that you subjectively determine to be just a hair bit above his, so that he has the opportunity to execute the type of tactical expression you're looking to develop with clean technique. Just enough overload to stimulate that, to where the overload is such that you can't get away with any brute force nonsense, but if you do it right, you will win the position. Now, if you can imagine that scaled approach over time, in which the intensity in which this more capable individual is using to roll with you is just enough to stimulate your technical expression that is efficient technical expression and allowing you to win various positions by presenting just enough resistance. And now apply this back to the psychological domain or any other. That's how that person who, if they're dealing with arachnophobia, and everybody recognizes, well, if you fill up a room with tarantulas and blindfold them and walk them into the room and remove the blindfold, probably not helpful. But what about if it's one tarantula and it's 10 feet away? And then the next session, it's either two tarantulas or you move them 9 feet away. and follow that line of logic, well, now it seems accessible that, all right, well, if I'm looking at it in this quantitative way, now I can see how in time they could walk into that room full of tarantulas, taking an incremental step-like approach in which the intensity, in this case of exposure, is not exceeding their existing capability and accessibility to the tool set that they have cultivated up to that point. And it's a universal concept that applies to any conceivable skill-based situation.
Bruh, Nsima, what do you plan on having for dinner tonight, man?
I'm going to have a center cut ribeye and a flat iron ×2 from Piedmontese.
Wait, how many steaks is that?
It's 3 steaks.
Oh my
You can have
gosh.
3 steaks, 2 flat irons, 1 center cut ribeye. And the great thing about these steaks is that they have a decent amount of fat, but it's not so much that if you had 3 steaks, you're going to be, eating a massive amount of calories. So that's why it's called the diet steak.
Yeah. So for myself, it's Friday. I'm kind of, a whole day or a whole week, I should say, of like some pretty solid eating. Like I've been on my game. So it's like today, I just want to go crazy on the big old steak. So I'm going to have a bavette.
There you go.
I know. And the funny thing is, it's like, I'm still going to be 100% on my plan because that whole thing has 100 grams of protein. I think only like 16 grams of fat. So I'm going to have that, probably some potatoes. Just, oh my gosh, I can't wait, dude. I'm going to... So if you guys want to enjoy some of these amazing steaks, higher protein, less fat, which just means more jackedness, less fatness, head over to Piedmontese.com. That's Piedmontese.com. At checkout, enter promo code Power Project for 25% off your order. And if your order is $99 or more, you get free 2-day shipping. Head over there right now.
What I find really interesting is, as you're using the jiu-jitsu analogy, it made me kind of think about how you can really tell within that martial art how big of a role an individual's like breathing can make. And Andrew Huberman was here yesterday and he was talking about the physiological sigh to help you calm down, right? And it can help individuals kind of calm themselves down. But in jiu-jitsu, you notice that when an individual starts to, maybe they're getting frustrated or flustered, they start breathing through their mouth, they start panicking. And I do a lot of nasal breathing, and I've noticed that by breathing through my nose, mentally, I'm extremely clear. So even when I get into bad situations where I'm actually going to get tapped, they're going to tap me. I know it's going to happen. Even though since I'm breathing through my nose, I'm still not panicking in this fucked up situation. And it allows me to more so be in an advantage when I'm rolling with most people, because I'm calmer than all of them usually. Now, this makes me wonder, with everything that we're talking about, there's your interpretation of what's happening, and you can kind of control that. But an example is, what if something so fucked up happens that you literally feel anger coming up, and you can interpret it, but there's this feeling? Do you have tools that we can use as far as our biology, our breathing? Because you now can feel this happening, but then you can start to slow it down or mitigate it or kind of use your breathing or whatever to control that.
Yes, however, and the reason I put that in there is if you have the conscious awareness of what's happening, then what's even more effective is to recalibrate the thinking. Because using your example, you're consciously recognizing this impulse reaction and anger is starting. If you consciously recognize that, then the most accelerated mode of resolving that situation is through a cognitive effort, because you're aware. The influence that breathing activities can have in stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system to essentially downregulate the sympathetic nervous system response, they're real, they're verified experimentally. Dr. Huberman explaining that. The thing is, what's being attempted to downregulate goes back to some type of an interpretation that caused it to happen to begin with.
This is why James is on the show. Because there's a lot of people that speak of philosophy and psychology, and there's a lot of people that brought up a lot of the Stoic philosophers. But I think a lot of the tools that have been shared from what I've seen, and I try to dig into this stuff quite a bit. I like looking at this stuff. I find it to be fun. I like to absorb as much information on this kind of topic as I can, and I haven't really stumbled upon anybody else talking in the way that you are, and maybe I've just missed it or something, but you're talking about like heading stuff off at the very, not even at the pass. You're talking about heading stuff off before it even has a chance to fully formulate, and you're like, I'm going to kind of intercept this right here, and I'm going to start to put the ingredients in it to formulate it right here and now. So it doesn't become, now it's still helpful to have those skills of the breathing. It's still helpful to understand we need to nourish our bodies. We need to make sure we get proper nutrition, proper sleep. These are all things that can assist. If you're tired every day and you're underfed or you're malnourished in some way, you have just a crappy diet, I mean, it can make things a little bit more difficult. So it would be in your best interest to learn some of those things as well. But in what you're talking about, it's like a psychological kind of interception of allowing these emotions to ever even like kind of like bleed out into our system.
I think that's really well said. You're correct. I think the reason why this is not common knowledge the way that it could be is a failure in the educational processes that result in individuals pursuing scientific domains, medical domains, therapeutic domains, whatever they are, that regarding this discussion we're having here, a huge void in the psychological enterprise is the emphasis on sociological study at the expense of an absence of both evolutionary biological and epistemological study. And what I've done on my own is craft a learning experience where I have for a very long time reviewed an enormous amount of research in varied fields that I've determined to be the most helpful to understand as regards to solving this type of problems. And the reason why it's been a heavy review of research is because the influx of published research, peer-reviewed, and fair enough, there's criticisms to be applied to that process. However, the rate of research being published far exceeds the reasonable speed in which, say, books can be published. So if you're interested in operating at the cutting edge, you have to acclimate yourself to reviewing the newest research, as opposed to limiting yourself to what's some book I can read that covers all this. It's not to dismiss the utility of books, because I'm a huge advocate for reading. It's just that regarding these domains in which there's so much more being discovered, not unlike in the technological enterprise, where it's sort of an exponential rate at which new knowledge is being created. And so that's the reason why in the mobile application that you referenced, I've aggregated epistemology, psychology, intellect, and culture to describe how those implicate each other. And I mentioned the scientific underpinnings, evolutionary biological, because there's so much to be informed upon, based upon gaining an applied understanding of the mechanism of evolution. And an absence of this, what I would describe as a system level understanding, is what would describe how certain individuals are missing a level of understanding that could be had otherwise, by way of not really thinking through the potential implications of various subject matter domains that are not necessarily at first glance obvious to select for as being necessary to understand, to solve given problems. And so
it's easier. I mean, it's easier to just for us to say, hey, you know what? I'm very sorry that you suffer from so much anxiety. It's very clear. I'm going to write you this script. This medication I think is going to be really useful. You know, here's a couple, maybe they might give you, you know, they might evaluate you even further, and they might give you some tips on some things that you can do. Maybe they might mention exercise, maybe they might, but they're probably not going to kind of hit you with this kind of stuff, because I think the era that we're in now, it seems like it's very rare that you would go to a specialist or expert, and these are probably the very people that should be sharing this information, that they say, you can fix this yourself. We should eliminate my job right now, and you should be able to fix this yourself. Let's train you to do that.
Given the right knowledge. Yes. It's been, you know, operating as an interdisciplinary consultant, a great deal of which has included psychological consulting over the years. There's been many times in which I've consulted for, had conversations with individuals who, in the first conversation, has said something to the effect, why have I never heard this from my psychologist? Why have I seen 7 different therapists in the last 12 years and no one mentioned this before? That's happened many times. And that's indicative of what, in my mind, it's curious how the nature of the conversation we're having is not elementary, is not common knowledge. That's curious to me because of how implicated this is in a human life. It's bizarre to me that this isn't what young children are not learning at the level at which they could comprehend in grade school. I don't.
Yeah, no, it's definitely very obvious. I mean, look at the reaction that your friend, you know, that somebody can think of their friend that they know that has divorced parents, somebody who has a parent that died when they're young, somebody who had the interpretation of how someone lives their life out that grew up without a mom or grew up without a dad or grew up without, you know, these particular circumstances. There's no direct correlation to someone being successful, you know, when they are missing one parent, or when they have both parents, or when they grew up with great circumstances or grew up with horrible circumstances. It just goes to show you the many different interpretations that you can have of something like that, and the many different interpretations that you can have of something really simple, like just having a day off of work. You know, you could sit at home all day and just sit on the couch and eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, or whatever you could think of that you would like to do that day. Somebody else's interpretation of a day off would be that they're going to go hike and jog 8 miles up a hill at high altitude. You know, it's like, it is pretty obvious that we have a lot of choices, but for some reason, when it comes to this emotional thing, what I kind of hear a lot of is a lot of yeah, buts.
Yes.
Yeah, I heard what you said, but that motherfucker pissed me off. You know, James, when you came in here and told me how I could better my business, that was very insulting, because you don't know anything about Slingshot. You don't know. I mean, we know each other. We've known each other, but that really made me mad. And it's like, well, just again, how do we reflect? How do we say, is that really useful? Maybe he had actually some good information, but maybe for some reason, some sort of bias I have in my own brain shut down the ideas, and I never even had a real chance to hear what you said. I just internalized it and interpreted it as something that has to make me mad for some particular reason.
I'm reminded of words from the late iconic Christopher Hitchens, who said, if someone tells me I've hurt their feelings, I respond with, I'm still waiting to hear what your point is. That just came to mind. The situation.
Don't use that, Nsima. I see that smirk on his face. I'm like, oh my God. Yeah,
don't worry. I won't use that.
Don't use that with women.
Why'd you only look at me? I get it. I feel you.
I saw you light up over there. You're getting ideas over there.
The one-time knowledge is not good power.
You can think it. You don't have to say it.
You don't have to say it.
That's right. Of course, you can imagine a circumstance in which that would go over well, if someone was already aligned with more of a practical mode of thinking. But certainly that could lead to explosions.
Well, and you mentioned your mom kind of getting mad that you're a particular way, that you're real kind of calm. And when we talked to Andy about it last night, she just kind of laughed because I don't know, it was either her or you or something made a reference to I don't care too much about certain things. And I think my wife, was telling you before I got there, I don't know how much our house costs, and I don't know how much this costs and that costs. And you guys were kind of laughing about it. That's an interpretation. You can laugh about it, or you can be mad about it. I don't understand how he thinks that way. Or you could just not think anything of it.
That's true. And it's probably worth pointing out, Nsima, the situation you described with your mother, very common in relationships, in whether they're familial, romantic or otherwise, in which one individual is less reactive, and how that can often escalate the emotional interpretation of the more reactive person. And without this knowledge, that can seem curious. So if I take the liberty of making some assumptions, there must have been times where, you're receiving this emotional dialogue, thinking doesn't make sense to respond with that. I'm just going to continue with my, see if we can talk our way through this. And then that logical thinking of, well, I won't meet fire with fire, that must be helpful. But then the fire got bigger.
Yeah.
Well,
you're talking about my last relationship, brother.
Yes.
Oh, this is great.
Anecdotally, I have personal experience similar to yourself. And the reason that happens is because the lack of the emotional engagement from the individual who's balanced emotionally in that moment is interpreted as a lack of caring.
Yeah.
Now, it's irrational because, of course, it doesn't make sense to demonstrate your caring by meeting fire with fire. That would be operating within a larger misconception. That would be utilizing irrationality to navigate a dysfunctional situation, which people do all the time as coping mechanisms in relationships that are dangerous for a person. Abusive relationships, for example, there's all sorts of coping mechanisms that can make sense in isolation, kind of going back to the discussion we had earlier, for survival reasons, while in the objective framing don't make sense because, why are you in that situation in the first place? What are the sequence of events that led to you being, it's a different discussion. But to go to that description, that's important for anyone who, say, has a similar disposition, male or female or otherwise. If someone is more operating close to baseline and they're realizing that, say, up till now, they've just thought that taking that non-engaging approach makes the most sense regardless of how crazy their partner is going, that what's important to do is not, in my opinion, to not hear something like this and think, oh, I guess it just makes more sense for me to meet them at their level and go my version of a little bit crazy. No, not what I would suggest. What I would suggest is, when moments of clarity return to that partner who is prone to becoming unhinged emotionally, to communicate how you do care. And in fact, the ability to express the sentiment each one of those individuals has towards the other is to express that through clear language and behavior and, physical forms of communication, not with inflammatory language that is incendiary and accusatory, etc. That would be the most effective thing, sort of to work towards being able to solve for those situations arising.
You could go on a walk with somebody. When we talked to Andrew Huberman, he's talking about the amygdala and calming down of the amygdala, like while going on a walk. So you could say, hey, let's talk about it more. Let's go on a walk. I found it personally helpful to just let people know have some way of acknowledging that you hear and understand what they're saying. You don't necessarily, in my opinion, you don't necessarily have to believe everything that you say, but you can just kind of figure out a way to assure them that you are understanding of what it, because in the moment you might start to get a little frustrated yourself, the fact that they're frustrated with you or something of that nature. But you know, do your best to be patient and to communicate and say, I heard what you said. I want to build upon that. Here's my thought process. And then you could, you know, hopefully at that point go back and forth in a reasonable way.
What comes to mind here is something we haven't touched on, is the organizational consulting that I do. If you can imagine, you know, what are the types of discussions I'm having with a chief executive or an HR representative, that the same logic applies. And so that's why I'm thinking of it here.
You're getting everyone on board, right?
That's the key, is that, so even if it's localized down to two people in a romantic relationship, or a company like Amazon with 800,000 employees, the same exact logic applies, in that if you can create for a shared sense of purpose that is collaboratively arrived at and adopted willfully, whether it's two people or a giant company, that's the greatest advantage. It goes back to me using the Catholic and the Muslim example, that it's more than just having strong explanations to persuade and compel people. It's having the willingness to be persuaded. And so if you can imagine the romantic relationship between two people, and each of those individuals adopting the same shared sense of purpose, as one example only, sort of what we're talking about here, the power of interpretation, that negative emotion is unhelpful, it's unhealthy, physiologically, psychologically. That is a hard to refute statement, right? It's going to be very difficult for any medical professional, any scientist, anyone to say, no.
What about somebody who says, but when I got mad at that person, I got the result I was looking for?
That would be
when I yelled at that guy, he gave me my money back. Or when I treated my girlfriend, when I ignored her, she, you know, whatever, you know, insert whatever.
When they speak to the manager and get their way.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm reminded of a wisdom of the late Karl Popper in speaking about a philosophical principle of inductive inference. Inductive inference describes a situation in one forms a generalized conclusion based upon limited evidence. And so what I'm imagining is someone who generalizes a conclusion that, hey, when I raised my voice with this individual, I got what I want. Therefore, I'm going to do that again in some other situation where what I want is hanging in the balance. So what we would want kind of goes back to because of or in spite of, that what we want to drill down on is, let's say it is a situation in which somebody got what they wanted by utilizing this negative emotional expression. What we would then want to take a look at is, might there have been a more favorable mode of getting what you wanted, in which the price you paid was less? Because there is a physiological cost to negative emotion. It is not controversial to describe the physiological ramifications of psychological stress, particularly of the chronic sort. The word stress is described by a variety of individuals in the scientific domain, must be differentiated. To use that word alone is irresponsible, because it is irresponsible to view the word stress as only having a negative connotation. That eustress, distress, depending upon the jargon one wants to assign, stress must be differentiated in that, what requires the muscles to look this way as it regards what you can do in terms of training requires that they are stressed in such a way in which the adaptive response is to grow. In the Popperian and Deutschian philosophy, no knowledge is created without the identification and correction of error. The conflict of
This is one of those things where I think I've mentioned, all knowledge is created through error correction. Is that correct?
All progress depends upon error identification and correction. All knowledge is created based upon conjectures and refutations,
Okay.
guesses and challenging what has been guessed. All progress, apart from pure accident, which does have to be acknowledged, certain progress has been made as a result of accidentally stumbling upon a solution and then conjecturing and criticizing what happened there and using that.
You went to do one thing and you stumbled upon an amazing invention that could be utilized for something else.
It's just that it would not be a particularly wise strategy to depend upon accidents occurring for progress, right? Certainly that happens, and that's one way of facilitating knowledge creation, but ultimately it is through guessing and challenging what has been guessed. And in effect, that still is what is happening in the event of an accident, because in order to understand why the accident was effective, you have to create knowledge. So you always have to create knowledge to learn. Learning is knowledge creation. As I stated in our conversation earlier, it is knowledge being created in the mind of the learner that did not previously exist. That's what learning is.
This is what you described to me yesterday after we got done with the podcast with Andrew Huberman, when I was saying, I'm not sure why, but I don't like to listen, and James actually kind of explained, it's not necessarily that I don't like to listen. It's that it's just a process that everyone needs to go through in order to adopt somebody else's information, right?
That's right. And someone like yourself, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you would agree that what your resistance is actually some form of tyranny. That what your resistance to is not learning from someone else. It's the mechanism by which that information is being transmitted, which is why there's a difference between, Mark, you got to do this, this, and this, which has that tyrannical connotation to it, like you're being instructed.
There's definitely a little bit of that. I also just think it's like maybe just my process of if someone like yesterday, some of the conversation, was leaning towards steroids are dangerous. I just think that's controversial. For me personally, I think it's controversial. Like they can be dangerous, but they can also potentially be really useful. I mean, they can be extremely harmful, and they can also be, I guess you can kind of maybe categorize all medications in that category, where it seems like they can be really useful. They got pros, they got cons. I mean, just about everything that we do goes that way. So sometimes when I hear somebody say a certain thing, I have to mull it over a lot in order to kind of like have it go through the right processes. And then eventually I will probably down the road be like, that guy was right.
And each one of us has to do that. Yeah. The rate at which that process occurs differs between people, but that's independent of, it's just important to point out that the rate at which, speed of processing and memory are not to be conflated with intelligence. And some people require longer to process information, and that's independent of how smart a person is. Regarding the dangerous concept, I'm reminded of the wisdom of the medieval alchemist Paracelsus, who stated, there are no poisons, only doses. And that provides perspective, because, a hot topic is firearms in this country, for example. And a firearm a medical intervention that consists of compounds with high addictive properties or a high level of toxicity, in my view, are more usefully interpreted in terms of the potentials that they have, as opposed to sweeping categorizations that might have profound psychological influences in those who do not otherwise possess a level of understanding that allows them to negotiate words that might have a much different implication on someone who doesn't have that knowledge. The AR-15 is a semi-automatic magazine felt, losing the ability to articulate myself here, magazine fed, shoots small caliber rounds, but at supersonic velocities, which is why they're effective at what they're designed for. They can be modified to fully automatic. I use that as an example because those have come under really hot debate as to whether those should be accessible by people who are not in, law enforcement or military, et cetera. And
I never shot one of those, by the way.
It's an example. If we map that as in terms of the potential threat that it poses, because it has a higher capacity for carrying rounds than other types of, say, semi-automatic handguns. If you look at that as similarly to, say, something like chemotherapy, which has another high toxicity component. It's why it's effective when it's effective. Or the difference between heroin and the difference between marijuana in terms of the addictive properties of one versus the other. I think the most helpful way to perceive or interpret these subject matters is through the scale of the potentials they possess. So more through a threat identification versus fear-based interpretation. I've heard a medical doctor describe all types of anabolic substrate testosterone derivatives as dangerous too, and I had the same thought that that's dismissive, because it's all a question of use, it's a question of dosage, and how, in the one hand, if a variety of compounds might be prescribed for different medical purposes, yet in another be, say, recklessly utilized, the difference between what's dangerous and what isn't has much less to do with the compound and much more to do with how it is used, just like a weapon. No bottle of anabolic steroids ever lifted a barbell, just as no loaded safety off weapon ever went on a shooting spree, just as no vial of heroin ever magically injected itself into somebody's arm. These are all things that have the potential to be dangerous if used irresponsibly. And I think that's just a healthy way to look at anything that has the potential to be dangerous.
I think our mind is that way. It's got potential to be dangerous, right? But it also has potential to not be dangerous. You can kind of, use your thoughts, use your thinking.
That's exactly right. That's sort of the bottom line here, is the power that the Stoics, at least in the Western world, were the first, to my knowledge, to bring to the broader collective of individuals, was that our thinking is the only thing that we have power over. And that must be distinguished from random thoughts that appear in consciousness. Like neither of you has control over the course of this speaking, whether the random thought popped in your head. How funny it would be if I dumped my bottle of water over James's head while he was explaining himself here. Like, say that thought arises. That's something that we don't have control over. Where the control comes into place is, what would you do with that thought? And so what I know is, as unlikely it is that you've had that particular thought since we've been talking. If you had, well, I know that you haven't acted on it. And we all know what that's like. We all know what it's like to have a random thought that might seem inappropriate for a given circumstance, and we can let our imaginations run and what that might be. And recognizing the control that we have over thinking must be distinguished from the lack of control we have over thoughts that enter our consciousness. It doesn't matter that we don't have control over the random thoughts that appear. What matters is we focus our attention on what we do have control over. And in fact, the only thing we have control over is our thinking. Because I tend to use my hands when I talk. Well, if I get paralyzed later today in such a way that I'm still living, well, I'll still be able to articulate myself, but no matter how much I want to move my hands, if I'm paralyzed in such a way that I'm a quadriplegic, well, there goes the control of my hands. But I still have control over my thinking. The moment I no longer have control of my thinking, I'm either asleep, I'm disabled, or I'm dead. Disabled in such a way in which there's damage to my brain. And so that's critically important to recognize for people, what we do have control over and what we do not have control over. So going back to someone who, say, is more frequently dealing with the challenge of negative thought loops, anxiety, depression, whatever it is, it's important to distinguish the part of that that they do not have control over from the part in which they do have control over. And then it bears the question to what extent they've thought critically about the part that they have control over.
I'm wondering, because I asked you earlier about, how we can use biology, breathing to affect all this, right? But it all even still comes back to the initial interpretation, which will then help you not have that upcoming feel of anger. I'm also wondering, like, habits as far as like being someone that consistently exercises and gets revenge, someone that consistently walks, moves, does things like sleeping also. That, the lack of sleep can affect a lot of things. But how big of a factor is this? Because when I think about this, I'm just like, somebody that doesn't exercise at all, they can still do this, right? But I, at least for my own personal experience, have noticed that when as I've been consistent with my physical activity over the years, the times that I haven't been are the times that I had more potential to be more volatile. Like, I wouldn't be that way, but if I ever had just annoyances or whatever, that would happen when I wasn't active or as active. Do you think that plays a big role for being able to go through these processes efficiently?
Tell me if I'm understanding you correctly, Nsima. You're asking me if I think your physical condition plays a role in how well you can adopt this way of thinking?
Not just your physical condition in terms of how good a shape you are currently, but just the activities you do as far as like working, exercising, walking, whatever, jiu-jitsu, just some type of continuous physical activity.
For him personally, he's saying when he exercises, he feels better, and it feels easier for him to make better decisions. And when he's been injured a couple times, he's been more irritable.
For example, when I was 13, that was like my first, I had Auschwitz-Slaughter. I was a soccer player for 7 years at that point. I started at 6, got injured at 13. And that was the first time for the few months that I wasn't able to literally run. That was the first time where like I became a recluse. Like I wouldn't talk to people. I would just shut myself in my room when I'd come back home. I was extremely different. I was able to start going to the gym. I went back to normal. It's my normal mode of being. So that's what I wonder for a lot of people who, let's say they don't have anything like that. And I've seen this happen to people. I've seen friends who they didn't have anything as far as physical activity or exercise. They started doing something like that. That gave them a cascade of positive habits, which helped them clear up their neuroticism.
Okay, understood. Okay, first, you were a football player.
Football player, yes. Football.
Second.
Yeah.
Second, okay, there's no question that a certain amount of stimulating the organism through physical exercise is suggested for. It's completely uncontroversial in terms of the physiological diagnostic measurements that are currently able to be performed, and how it's conclusive that there's such thing as a certain amount that is absolutely healthy for everyone. However, when we talk about the degree to which that, whatever that form that comes in, we do not want to form a situation in which there's a dependency on that to be in a healthy state of mind. Because then what you're doing is you're divorcing yourself from the power that you have over your thinking and attaching it to an external factor. So the freedom here is acknowledging the distinction between those two. So on the one hand, the physical exercise, anything that's enjoyable for an individual, that is a positive. There's no question about that. And we want to make sure that any individual who derives a positive phenomenological experience from fill in the blank with whatever the exercise is not dependent upon it in such a way to maintain that state of psychological composure. The same is true for anything that anyone might ascribe themselves to as an explanation for what provides them with psychological balance. Anything that one would describe as having play that role in their life that is anything but their own thinking has created a dependency upon some external factor, which is something that I would advise against, simply because you're creating a condition of volatility there in which if something interferes with your interaction with that external factor, if something happens to the external factor itself, depending upon what we're talking about here, then now you are that much more susceptible to negative interpretations.
I get what you're saying there. And I guess this also makes me wonder, the big thing that we've been talking about was how to manage stress and negative emotions and negative interpretations. But how about the other end of things? How about, people are always seeking happiness. People are always like, what is the best way for me to feel happy? What is the best way for me to feel good? What is your look on that?
First, I would say that is outside of the bounds at what we can speak about objectively in terms of something like a quantitative evaluation, something that you guys will have spoken about a lot on here, something like a comprehensive blood work evaluation with a lot of different biomarkers, not just the lipids, not just the triglycerides, not just the liver enzymes, the whole network understanding of what's happening on the basis of what can be understood on the basis of blood work analysis. While it's not completely objective because all data has to be interpreted, and it's through that interpretation that different opinions, you get somebody who is an advocate of carnivore and someone who's more an advocate of sort of conventional medicine, looking at the exact same lipid profile. You could have very different opinions. That being stated, what there's no controversy surrounding is, by and large, what those quantities represent, which is to say, if something is quantified in terms of nanograms per deciliter, then we can agree that that's the quantity, and that's the quantity that it says you have in your system right here. Where we might not agree is, well, what does that mean? But we can't agree on the quantity, and that's the advantage of the more quantitative we can become, the more accurate the measurement can become. And the greater the resolution of measurement, the more accurate the measurement. And so what is, in my view, irrefutable is what, as one example only, the physiological measurement of stress conditions represent in terms of what's compromised within the system. Is it related to hypertension? Is it related to obesity? Is it related, we go through these different possible ramifications of psychological stress and their physiological effects. That's what is more simple to clarify to most individuals, in which case there's much more consensus agreement on healthy, unhealthy as it regards physiological assessment, where I disagree with it, but there's a much broader spectrum in terms of emotionally empathizing with all sorts of negative emotion coming from whether it's clinical communities or otherwise, that basically they're much less effective at solving for what's creating those problems. And they do more facilitating than they do assist in creating for the knowledge that is necessary to resolve. So the more the attempt to being objective in the analysis of a given person's phenomenology, the more persuasive that argument can become. Because short of attempting to convince someone solely on the basis of explanation, you can, allow me to rephrase, to be able to add to the strength of explanation is to present information, additional information, say that comes as the result of measurement, that is difficult to refute, that is difficult to widely interpret. Something that comes to mind, if that's becoming too abstract for listeners, is something like the calcium score that anybody can have done, that anybody is recommended to have done above the age of 40. Go to any radiology clinic and ask to be scheduled for one. And what it's looking at is in a quantifiable way, it's a CT scan that is looking at the percentage of plaque buildup in the arteries of the heart. And maybe it's the one physiological diagnostic that has the most gravity and consensus agreement surrounding it, in which they have a scoring system. 0 is 0 plaque in the arteries, and it scales up from there. And the bigger that number is, the more likely you are to be susceptible to various types of heart disease, arteriosclerosis, etc. Unlike a lot of other biomarkers, using the lipid as an example, where there can be differences of opinion for different reasons. And so the more objective something can become, it's just an advantage, because what that means is we can have consensus. And so as it regards the psychological, the more avenues there are to strive for that objective consensus agreement, that it is not helpful to be dealing with negative emotion, certainly with any frequency. And what's more, everyone, barring a very small percentage of the population that does not have the cognitive control, has the ability to make different choices in the form of different interpretations of the world that result in different reactions. So it's getting past the misconception that facts equal reactions. This is false. Facts must be interpreted, and then we react. It seems simple, but it's a critically overlooked misconception. Nothing exists outside of the bounds of that objectively true statement. Fill in fact with anything that comes to mind. A child, the weather, COVID-19, politics, the climate, anything. A job, income, house, responsibilities, bills, the state of affairs in Afghanistan currently, fill it in with anything, that anything must be interpreted, made sense of. Then the reaction occurs. It's never event equals reaction. Cannot be. Must be interpreted. Must be processed in such a way that explains the reaction.
So is that how you determine what to pursue? Because earlier we were speaking about a certain pursuit that you had zero interest in because it might be too easy. But if we are going to be immune to outside events, how do we know if something is for us and something isn't? If our interpretation of it, or I guess our reaction to it, is equal, or equanimity. You know, if we're trying to chase equanimity, then how do we know what something is for us then?
Based upon what one finds interest in. Interest is the starting point for all knowledge creation. So what any one of us right now, I like to use the example, if any one of us was given the opportunity to provide a lecture to an audience of the most knowledgeable people in that field in the world, what might influence our decision making as to what we would speak about? Well, what we would speak about is what we're most knowledgeable in. This goes for anybody. And what anyone is most knowledgeable in is what they are most interested in. Interest drives the knowledge bus, if you like. And psychological balance, composure, equanimity, existing at what I refer to as baseline, does not mean that one loses sight or the capacity to recognize interest. In fact, in my hypothesis, everything sort of subsumes the binary form of interest or disinterest. And so what you are able to recognize about yourself is what you find interesting. It's just that what you find interesting is within your domain of thinking through critically regarding what sort of cascade of thoughts and potential emotions amount as a result of how you're interpreting what you're interested in. And so if we use an example of, say, something that's happening today in the world, such as the situation in Afghanistan, say that that's interesting to someone because that someone is involved in human rights work. So they've attached a large value, a large significance to what's the human rights situation in any part of the world. And so in the type of consulting that I perform, if an individual that fills that description was to state that, you know, I have a sincere interest in solving for human rights issues, and I'm aware of what's been happening in Afghanistan, and it's really difficult for me. I'm having a really hard time emotionally empathizing with all the women, etc. Then the way this conversation would shape would be, well, understand how the extent to which you have the ability to provide problem solving as it regards that or any other situation in the world depends upon your most clear and rational and logical thinking. And so any moments you're spending negatively interpreting the reality of what exists there or anywhere else is time taken away from your ability to assist in solving for that problem. Because no amount of solving for problems is going to have any long-term solution connected with emotional negativity, emotional explosion. The same is true for anyone who erroneously decided to raid the Capitol building not long ago, or on the other end of this political spectrum decided to burn down a grocery store. Anyone who's operating under the opinion that, well, sometimes it takes something like that to catalyze the beginning of problem solving in the direction that it's intended to solve for, is operating under the misconception that though it's less spectacular and less clickbait on the media and the rest, that reasonable, logical discourse is built to solve for every problem that is otherwise attempted to solve for example, with violence. You know, outside of the competitive domain, the very reality of a fight is the inability to resolve the conflict through means otherwise. And so what happened? It resulted in a fight. It is the failed, whether or not the attempt was made, it's what happens when, for example, all attempts fail to reason, and then what ends up finalizing a physical altercation. So you can just scale that up to a war. Clearly, everybody benefits from being able to reason as opposed to send, I'm a military veteran, as opposed to send troops and to use ground forces or use sea forces or air forces. Clearly, everyone wins. It's a non-zero sum game, win-win, if we can solve this with dialogue. So whether it's a fist fight or a full-scale war, either are examples of a failure to reason. And for that reason, everyone is wise to consider how much ground they can cover being committed to reason logically and rationally, as opposed to being bogged down, disadvantaged by, et cetera, with negative emotion.
I think something Nsima was asking that maybe you didn't get to, because I think you went off on some other stuff, but like, I think he was asking about happiness and like just maybe kind of the pursuit of happiness.
You did.
And I want to make a guess at this one before you go. I'm assuming that you're going to say something along the lines of, since it's not a problem situation, you probably don't need to give a lot of thought to it. And also, on the same lines, maybe be cautious of your expectations of going, thinking that something is going to make you happy or give you happiness.
I have a theory which I describe in the application as emotional physics.
Oh yeah, the potential thing, right?
Yeah. On balance, Nsima, if you think of emotion as a potential, meaning it can manifest in a positive or negative form, like a weapon, like anything else, it's how it's being, in this case, how the interpretation describes whether it goes in the positive or negative direction, that I postulate that human emotion functions the way physics describes the characteristics of a sine wave or a pendulum, in which, in the case of a sine wave, the peak deviation from zero is the same in both directions, no matter the amplitude. It's the same in both directions. Same as a pendulum. The arc that it swings on either side of the point in which it hangs motionless is the same in both directions, just as emotional potential. So someone who's, to use the phrase, chasing positive emotion must recognize, this is how I would respond to that, just recognize that the amplitude that you're seeking opens you up to the susceptibility of having the approximate experience in the negative direction should you interpret anything negatively. That however high your highs are means you're capable of descending the same distance in the negative direction. So the strength of the emotional expression. is the same in both directions, the larger that potential is. And so the reason that I advocate for baseline and operating in a state of equanimity or near it is such that you do not lose sight of positive and negative, because it goes back to you do not lose sight of what you're interested in and what you're disinterested in. It's that the distance that you travel in either direction is smaller. Now, I'll add to that. I make the argument that, say I copy myself, and this copy of myself is creating knowledge in such a way that results in this copy of myself being an advocate of strong emotional experience. And so they practice interpreting the world this way. What I argue is, if both of us are the recipient of something that is irrefutably advantageous, such as using my existing business model, that if it explodes and there's that much more corporate clients, what have you, and then therefore the capital result is substantial, that let's just say, for sake of example, that's a positive thing. So say the copy of myself goes through the typical sort of the stereotypical behavior of the person who wins the lottery. Whereas, speaking for myself, I know how I would react in such a situation. There would not be no strength of jumping up and down, but there would be a recognition of that's very helpful. That's great news. Like, this is going to allow for a lot of different problem solving, et cetera, et cetera. Someone might say, "Oh man, boy, did that model of James operating in the state of equanimity, look at him losing out on that joy that his copy is having. Like, he's missing out on that. Like, his copy's doing cartwheels and jumping up and down and hugging strangers." And, James version 1, all he said was, that's good news, that's great news, that's helpful, et cetera. He's missing on that, what life has to offer. My argument there is, I'm benefiting more than my copy, because in my balanced state of mind, I'm actually able to think through all the ways that this will be helpful, and how those, whether they're collaborations or partnerships or individuals in whom I can assist, et cetera, that's all accessible to me. So while my copy is jumping up and down and hugging and screaming and celebrating, I'm already in the mode of thinking how this news can be practically deployed, et cetera, et cetera. And so it comes back to, I mentioned this briefly earlier when I said the greater the resolution, the more accurately you can measure. It comes back to the resolution which one chooses to evaluate situations. Because a more parochial one, in my view, would be just looking at the emotional experience. To me, that's parochial. A more sophisticated level is thinking through, I heard something that the clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson said, using a sophisticated mode of analysis or a sophisticated mode of explanation to effectively convey a point, such that you're not losing any information that would be lost if you oversimplify. This is critical. You don't want to overcomplicate in a way that is unhelpful, and you don't want to do the opposite, which is to oversimplify and lose essential meaning to convey a point. And so in utilizing sophisticated analysis or explanation, it's important to recognize that there is, in my judgment, more to be appreciated the closer one exists to baseline, because of the depth and breadth of intellectual resources that you're able to apply to a given situation.
And for that clone of yours that got super happy and was doing cartwheels, if the rug's pulled out from underneath, or it turns out that employee or that major sales pitch that worked really well, it was for a company with 7,000 people, but the contract, not everything was fully signed just yet, and turns out they released a lot of people and they downsized and they're outsourcing and they're doing A, B, and C, and now there's only 4 people there. So instead of getting X amount of money, now you maybe still have, right? So you kind of walk yourself through all these different scenarios of, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I will also say that occasionally when I see somebody get super pumped, especially when it's about something that I'm observing as being like something super simple, I'm kind of like, I guess I could say I'm jealous of them in a way sometimes, because I'm like, man, I wish I was that. I kind of wish I was that easily amused or excited, you know, about a thing. But that's just not the way I've ever really been.
There's a cover, I think it was Time Magazine, 1980, the low statistical probability in which the U.S. Olympic ice hockey team defeated what at that time was the Soviets. It happened in the course of the rounds of the playoffs leading towards the Olympic final. And what this image cover captures, you've reminded me of there, one of the Soviet players, he's kind of got his chin on his stick, and the U.S. team is going bananas on the ice. And the Soviet player has a smirk on his face. It's a smirk sort of, I wouldn't want to imitate it here, but it's something that projects he's kind of getting a kick out of this expression of the win, because in their culture,
he wouldn't do that. Yeah.
Yeah. It was just, their cultural conditioning was, well, winning is the result of executing the tactics of the game superior than the opponent, you know, scoring one more point than the opponent. That's the objective. And that just kind of brings to bear, I think, an interesting, it's a philosophical discussion on what's better. What's something that, is there a stronger explanation for or against one or the other, et cetera? And I would not suggest for anyone to be this way or be the other way, but more sensibly just evaluate what explains either reaction and what sounds more interesting to you, and make your own decision. Similarly, to recognize, it goes back to the potential that, using that example, presumably those Soviet players at the time were, if I'll make the assumption, operating on some version closer to baseline. The U.S. players, not so much. And as a result, if we generalize now, because I can't speak for anybody, what we know is the way that potential works, or rather how I theorize how it works, is like that sine wave, is like that pendulum. And so if someone has framed their mode of interpreting reality in such a way that results in interpretations that manifest as strong emotional expressions in the positive direction, then assuredly, when something approximate to that in the negative direction occurs, then you're going to see something approximate to that emotional expression in the negative direction. That magnitude of grief, that magnitude of depression, that magnitude of sadness, that magnitude of anger, simply because these things are like potential. A sum of money is similar. If we go to a casino and you say, hey, James, I want to put $1 million down. And I say, I want to put $10. Potentially, you can win a hell of a lot more than I can. You can also lose a hell of a lot more. So it's just a choice people make.
To drive it home a little bit more, just on what you're talking about, you know, being at this event that I went to recently, Bottle Rock, is a music festival. Some people's interpretation of the music was to dance and to be all fired up and to, you know, kind of go crazy. Some people, like when a different band came up or a different musician or artist came up, there was different interpretations of it was all music, People were playing similar things. They're either like singing or rapping or, playing a whole host of instruments. But each person had their own interpretation of what they liked, how they liked it, and then how they reacted and responded to it, to the point where people would be dancing, they'd be super excited, that band would stop, another band would come on, and they'd start playing, and people would be like, these guys are garbage, and and there was other people who were like, oh, this is that band was cool before them, but this band's even better, and then they get more excited. There was a whole host of different kinds of music. There was everything from rap to country to rock to metal. There's all kinds of different things. So each person had their own, it probably has to do with some of our exposure, like how long you've been exposed to these things. Maybe some people were exposed to certain types of music when they were younger. Maybe it's just flat out preference for who the hell knows why. But different people, some people will even say when certain songs come on, they'll say, I can't help but dance to that. And you might be like, really? That song's garbage. Like, that song's crap. It isn't. But this other song is the song, the song that gets me fired up, or whatever it might be.
In the degree to which responses are actually more reflex oriented, or the results of interpreted, in which there's no sort of conscious accessibility, in which someone might think it's the reflex action when in fact they've conditioned themselves, that's explained by a theory that physicist David Deutsch has shared, in which he differentiates theories or ideas on the basis of explicit knowledge, inexplicit knowledge, and unconscious knowledge, which, if I summarize, the explicit knowledge is something that has the conscious accessibility to their explanation in the moment in which the event is happening. Inexplicit knowledge would be something in which you have a sense for or an intuition for as it's happening, but you don't have the time or the opportunity to explain yourself. But maybe after the fact, you can reflect with explanatory knowledge. Unconscious, by definition, you have no conscious connection to, yet ideas that are occurring on the unconscious level can affect us phenomenologically. An example of that would be an unconscious interpretation of some event that results in an emotional feeling, right? One of these catecholamines, without being released into the system as a result of an unconscious interpretation that can surprise someone with, like, where did this come from? This feeling of fill in the blank, like this seems to have come out of nowhere. That would be an example of unconscious. And I think what's very persuasive about David's argument is that feelings of discontent, basically anything negative emotional, is a conflict in one or more of those idea centers. The inexplicit being asymmetrical with the explicit, or the explicit being asymmetrical with the unconscious. Point is, it's a theory, and I think it's a compelling one, in that we must think critically about how these forms of information processing exist in the brain. And so whether that regards a musical performance or anything else, what we can perhaps agree upon is what is the price that we pay for our form of interpretation. And so if we're disinterested in something, the efficient interpretation is simply to recognize, not so much interested in that one. Let's see what's happening next. And that works in the opposite direction. Like, that was fantastic. That was great. And who knows, like, well, let's see what's happening next. And understanding that if it's something different than that, if it's more a mode of emotional processing in terms of inhibiting the reasoning capacity in favor of, let's just try to feel this as much as we can, well, then you just have to know that what comes with that territory is, you conditioning yourself to feel things as much as you can emotionally is subject to those amplitudes in which you feel things. And then the difference between your positive and negative interpretation sends that feeling in either direction, and that those amplitudes are likely to be approximate to each other. And it's just sort of like caveat emptor, like buyer beware.
Andrew, are you recording this?
Yeah, let's see. That was a good warm up. We can hit record the next one, though.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, you're going to want to record this because are we in a simulation?
I have no idea. It seems unlikely.
Because, like, why did you seek out David Deutsch? I mean, I think you went as far as like to go to his house. You researched all his stuff. You've communicated with him. I think now he's become a friend. But this is a quantum mechanics. Am I saying that right? A quantum physics professor. Why would this particular person have answers into? I've heard him laugh before when people kind of ask him about some of these questions, because he's like, why would anybody leave it to me to tell you how to live your life? You know. Right. So why did you seek him out? How does he have answers that can help us with stress? It seems like an odd place to find some of the information that you found.
It started in, it was 2007, when, as I was explaining in a previous career that that I have, where I was extremely disinterested in what I was doing. And I was explaining with I think at the dinner conversation last night, that I've had this affinity for theoretical physics going back a long way. And so I was considering pursuing postgraduate studies and leaving what I was doing due to the disinterest in favor of pursuing physics research. And I discovered David, a TED talk of his that he gave in 2007. And I was captivated by his mode of explanation. And so that started it. And
what did he say there that sparked? Do you remember?
It was the quote that I have in the beginning. I have a book that I wrote called The Governing Dynamics of Coaching. The first page of the book is a quote from David, which is that the limiting factor is not resources, for they are plentiful, but knowledge, which is scarce. And he said that as just in passing in the TED talk, and it seared into my brain as a knowledge dense, concise phrase that really, as a result of my interpretation, does just great work at breaking down various empiricist viewpoints, etc. And it wasn't immediate at that point. Like I didn't have his books until some years after that. And The Fabric of Reality was already written by that point. And I didn't get into reading more until some years later. But what I wouldn't say that David considers me a friend. That would be nice. I have a very high opinion of him, and he was extremely friendly to me, inviting me to his home for sure. But I'm certain he does not consider me a friend. But well, I wouldn't want to speak for him, but I did share my mobile application with him, which was great to get his critical feedback on. And the way that happened was many years after my initial exposure to him. After I had published the book that I mentioned, I was traveling with a friend who we've spoken about to England, and I knew that I was going to be in the region in which David lives and works. And so I sent him an email asking if I could take him out to dinner as a thanks, just for how influential his work has been on me. And I quoted him many times in the book, and I sent him a copy of the book. And he said, "How about you come over to my place for tea instead?" And I thought, what a generous offer, fantastic. And so yeah, we flew to England, and up all night. I never sleep on planes really, and dropped the people I was traveling with off at the golf course, and then I drove an hour to Oxford Oxfordshire, where he lives. And yeah, we sat on his couch and had a conversation for about 4 hours, and just fantastic. Just the towering explanatory knowledge that he is in possession of. There's levels, right? Because the degree to which my explanatory knowledge is held in favor of any, there's levels to explanatory knowledge, just like jiu-jitsu skill or anything else. And David's mind is operating on a level in which, in my personal opinion, his contributions to, not limited to the epistemology philosophically more broadly, including what he's doing in the physics domain, I think that he exists in the space of individuals whom might be considered in the conversation of the most important person who's ever lived. It's a personal opinion that I have. This is kind of my typical fashion of answering a question in a more lengthy way. How does that influence my strategies for this type of consulting? So David does not speak towards psychology per se. What he speaks towards in ways that I have borrowed from that implicate heavily my mode of consulting is the epistemology of critical rationalism, what in some circles is referred to as Deutschian philosophy, Popperian from Karl Popper.
Can you explain what some of those words mean, epistemology and critical rationalist?
Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that answers the question, what is knowledge and how is it created? And there are many epistemologies on offer if one goes online and looks up through various resources. Broadly speaking, they're divided into the rationalist or the empiricist. Broadly speaking, there's many derivatives, and anyone is wise to seek to understand all of them so that you can form your own conclusions. But broadly speaking, there's rationalist and empiricist. The rationalist epistemology posits that knowledge is a product of reasoning. It is a product of guessing, conjectures, and challenging what's been guessed, criticism or refutation. And therefore, it is not derived from anything. It's created. We guess, we challenge what's been guessed back and forth until we form good and hard to vary explanations. And then we tentatively accept them as true, but only tentatively, because knowledge is always conjectural. On the empiricist side, the posit is that knowledge is derivative of experience. Now, what goes along with that is that knowledge is a product of sensory impression, because experience is sensory impression. It is a fallacy, yet it occupies, I would conjecture, most people in the world's thinking. If you're just looking at population level modes of epistemology that most people don't consciously recognize. Like most people aren't walking around thinking, I share the epistemology of such and such. Yet most people are operating on the basis that is informed by one or the other, broadly speaking, divisions. A history lesson, I'll keep it briefer. In the West, which is important to delineate, the most robust period in Western history was the Renaissance. It was this explosion of creativity, of ideas in the arts, in the painting, architecture, etc., sculpture, science. So not just the arts, just an explosion of creativity across the domains. And at the tail end of that, in the end of the 17th century into the 18th century, some of the smartest people of the day, this was namely in the Scottish Enlightenment the philosophers, David Hume and John Locke, the brilliant individuals of the time, they sought to form a more logical reason to appeal to someone on the basis of, say, their wisdom, which up to that point was synonymous with the church. In the Western world, the church was synonymous with the concept of intellectual authority, even though that in and of itself is a conundrum. There's no such thing, because all knowledge is conjectural and anybody can create knowledge according to the critical rationalism. So up to that point, the church was synonymous with the intellectual authority, false though that concept is. And the philosophers of the day realized, well, there's got to be something better than "I told you so," which was essentially what the church was positing to the world. Sort of align yourself with what we're giving you or pay the price. Clearly, we can do better than that. And the philosophers of the day, as noble and as, righteous as their intentions were, what they came up with was equally as fallacious. What they came up with was empiricism. That knowledge derives from the senses, it derives from experience, and therefore the people who we should appeal to or hold in the highest regard as it regards their wisdom are those among us who are the most experienced. And we can imagine just how much this has influenced thinking to this day. Again, consciously or not, whether people are walking around thinking, I'm an empiricist, whether or not that's part of the conscious experience, we can recognize the weight or the gravity that most people assign to experience.
I think that I might be a little bit of both, because when if I heard someone say a statement like, let's say they say intermittent fasting, like I'm not a huge fan of it or it doesn't work, I would be critical if they never really tried to employ it at all themselves. While I would also recognize that they don't have to necessarily do it themselves to have an understanding of what it is. They could have they could have researched it. They could have experience through other people that they maybe have worked with. So I think I might use a little bit of both.
And that's everyone's prerogative. The key is to recognize the specific truth regarding where does knowledge come from. And that's where the arguments go back and forth between those two broad categories. The rationalist, which the most profound work in that domain was done by the late Karl Popper. And what David Deutsch has done an incredibly comprehensive job in sort of taking that steps further amongst other people in that community. And the strong distinctions exist between, on the one side, the empiricist side stating that knowledge derives from experience, and on the critical rationalist side stating not only is that not true, not only does knowledge not derive from anywhere, it integrates. Those mathematicians out there, knowledge is an integral, not a derivative. It is a sum in which guesses and challenges accumulate over time, and the remainder is either a good and hard to vary explanation or one that is discarded because it is refuted. What's more than that is we've had the conversation before, not only does knowledge not derive from anywhere, including experience, knowledge can be created without any experience. No experience is required to create knowledge. And I found what goes a long way at either convincing or opening the gateway to do that to others who might at first, hearing of this, be put on the defensive, is to redefine what most people understand as experience. I think a lot of that is where the misconception comes from. I would conjecture that most people who listen/watch this, when asked, say, what was that experience like listening to this conversation that the four of us had? most people would start to go into the topics that were covered and what they thought about what each one of us had to say, et cetera, et cetera. When in fact, this experience or any experience is nothing more than a much more basic level of sense data interpretation. So what I mean by that is, I just said the phrase, what I mean by that is. And anyone can agree, particularly with the benefit of, having recorded this, yeah, he just said what I mean by that is. However, the experience that you had was not listening to me say and understanding what I mean by that is. What you say heard, if this is an audio listening, you heard sound that was transmitted electronically, digitally, with the aid of quantum mechanics, et cetera, that allowed, whether you're wearing a headset or the speaker on your electronic device, to amplify that sound. And that sound vibrated the small bones and fluid in your inner ear. That data, sound waves. In some basic level of interpretation, not of the cognitive sort, but more of sort of disseminating the differences between timbre and volume and pitch. That's the end of experience. That's the experience. We're looking at each other right now. The experience is not the description of what we see in the descriptive sense. It's simply light reflecting off of objects. That light reflects off the back of the retina that's fed by the optical nerve to the visual cortex, basal levels of interpretation. But to think that the experience, say, Nsima, of me looking at you, for me to think that the experience of looking at Nsima is to take into account your skin color, the color of your hat, your shirt, your muscularity, your height, these types of things, that's not the experience. The experience is just the light reflection. I think that most people conflate with experience are the cognitive processes where knowledge is created and assume that that's part of the experience. And with the critical rationalist community, if I may be so bold as to speak for it, is to draw a distinction there in which where we distinguish experience from knowledge creation is at that dividing line when, for example, when knowledge integrates from an experience, which it doesn't have to. Again, it can come out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. But say we create knowledge on the basis of an experience, there's a dividing line, in which case the experience ends at the level of sense data, reception, and some level of basal interpretation, and then translates into guesses and challenging what's been guessed. This happens largely at a unconscious or subconscious level, in which case most people in the process of learning, for example, are not thinking about, I'm going to guess, then I'm going to challenge that, now I'm going to challenge that, I'm going to guess it, now I'm going to guess again, and I'm going to challenge that. It's usually not necessarily mechanical in the conscious experience. However, that's exactly what is happening. Any basis of the conversation that we've had that's being recorded or before it was being recorded, or anybody listening, will have been from any one of us challenging in their mind the credibility, the explanatory strength of what was stated. And anything learned will have only been learned as a result of that individual in their mind creating knowledge in their mind that did not previously exist on the basis of challenging the information that was presented, such that, oh yeah, that James thing said about, the rationalism versus the empiricism. Knowledge is an integral; it's not derivative. It doesn't have anything to do with experience. All right, and then you're rolling that around in your head. Let me see if I can find a hole in that explanation. Like in your head, that's what's happening. Let me see if I can find an exception to that. Is that really true, what he said? Let me think about that. And then what happens is you only accept something as being true in the critical rationalist framework if it survives that level of criticism. And you only accept it tentatively. because as Popper shared, all knowledge is conjectural. It's all part guesswork. And as Popper introduced the principle of fallibilism, we're all mistake prone. We're all prone to making errors. And therefore, all of our knowledge must be mistake prone. So all we can have is the best explanation so far, which is not to be confused with the best explanation there ever will be. We want to eliminate dogma, eliminate the knowledge that prevents itself from being questioned. This is very dangerous to the possibility for societies progressing, et cetera. Yet there's a lot of it that exists in different forms. As we are all mistake prone, all knowledge is therefore mistake prone. And so the most we can do is evaluate knowledge on the strength of its explanatory power. And Deutsch has an excellent answer for what is that strength characterized by, and that is an explanation is good if it is hard to vary and all of its details serve a functional role. If an explanation is easy to vary, it's not good. An explanation can be good in the sense that it is hard to vary and all of its details serve a functional role, and it can be wrong. An explanation can be bad because it's easy to vary, but it can be true. Mark, how'd you get so strong? Answer, bad explanation. I worked hard. Because that's easy to vary, and you could apply I worked hard to, now I'll ask you a different question. Mark, the business is so successful. What's the explanation? I worked hard. Mark, you've got this great marriage and kids, et cetera. What's the explanation? We worked hard, right? It's easy to vary. It applies to many different situations. And it's true because hard work did go into everything, but it's not a good explanation because it's too easy to vary. And if you turn the answers into hard to vary explanations, then they have the property that they make no sense in the context of any other question. They're only suitable for that one example. And that's one of the properties of strong explanations, that in their details serving an operational role and being hard to vary, that they are adhering themselves to that circumstance and not other ones. That being said, the property of sort of generalizing to more good theories is that the foundations of them are present in many other good theories. And so that's important to recognize too. But in terms of explaining yourself and answering a question, the more robust and good and hard to vary that explanation is, it won't make sense if you use it to answer an unrelated question. And so that's important to recognize. And the depth at which this can go requires a lot of reading, because Popper wrote encyclopedic novels on more than one of these subject matter areas. And as you know, David Deutsch has 2 books out so far that are, in my opinion, the most knowledge-dense writing, certainly that I've ever encountered. And there's a lot to think about in the domain. But the reason why it's important to make the distinction between empiricism and rationalism is because of how implicated each of the other is in our psychology. And so that's why I state that the most important distinction is in the context of the discussion that we've been having. There's many other contexts in which it has relevance. Because in the critical rationalist framework, we're evaluating everything on the strength of the explanation. You know, have you convinced me on the strength of your explanation? And so if one adopts this worldview and then applies it to their psychology, you realize that this is an exceptional tool for working towards solving psychological problems. So this goes for both the clinicians as well as anybody out there who's looking to solve their own problems, is that going back to the negative emotion being masochistic, well, how might one be persuaded that that's true by that person being convinced that interpretation is a choice and that negative emotion is unhealthy? And so therefore, because it's a choice and because negative emotion is unhealthy, the superior explanation is to correct for how we're interpreting the world. And different reactions will follow that are healthy. Healthy being used in the objectively diagnostic context, not just James's opinion on healthy, but what do the physiological assessments demonstrate? And so there's a huge distance that people can go in the epistemological context with regard to resolving issues of psychology by evaluating the existing theories, strategies, etc., that exist both in the clinical domain as well as just what each individual carries into their worldview, by evaluating them on the strength of their explanatory power, independent of all other considerations.
Damn. Are we in the Matrix? I know you said you're a fan.
Unlikely.
What about multiple universes? You've stumbled upon some of this stuff?
Yes. Okay. How can I answer you in a way that's helpful? The
aliens? We got aliens. You stumble. I mean, if you're dealing with quantum mechanics, you're probably dealing with space and maybe knowing some stuff about some of these things.
On the aliens question, there's a lot of people who have thought deeply about this for a long time. There's a lot of sort of mathematical probabilities that can be utilized in the thinking of this answer, and there's compelling theories either way, simply due to the scale of the observable universe, which is expanding. But given that if you were to take a static picture for the sake of sort of discussion, the immensity of the observable universe is beyond most people's practically accessible comprehension. 93 billion light years, if I remember correctly. Our galaxy, the Milky Way, is 100,000 light years across. So that means is if you're at one pole of the Milky Way and you shine a light, it takes that light 100,000 years to reach the other end of it. Whereas to traverse the observable universe, 93 billion, I might be mistaking billion with trillion. A physicist out there will correct me. At minimum, it's 93 billion. So that's beyond most people's comprehension, because there's nothing that most people who don't deal with these types of thinking problems don't have anything to relate that to. And so that's why it can be helpful to have analogies such as, a stack of 1 billion pennies, like how high does that reach? And you can do calculations like this to give yourself some perspective on, the difference between 1 billion and 1 million is massive. And you scale that to whatever degree you have to attempt to grasp this. So given the scale of the observable universe, it just seems likely that we're not the only ones. And I state that given the extraordinary circumstances that are necessary to arise not only in life, but complex life. That's an important distinction, because what you wouldn't get as much pushback from astrobiologists and different types of physicists in this matter, what you probably would not get as much pushback from is the statement, that some type of life is present in some other stellar object somewhere in the observable universe. This could be something existing in the microorganism level, which is a much different claim than there are independently abstract thinking, self-aware, intelligent beings. Vast, vast difference between those two. That said, again, given the scale of the observable universe, it seems certainly plausible that there are other abstract thinking, self-aware, intelligent entities. It's just that when you think that through, what you ask yourself is, okay, well, if they were a more advanced species than us, then they would have that much more technological advance in terms of, manipulating their environments, their atmospheres, modes of space travel, et cetera. But what they cannot do, provided the laws of physics are understood correctly, is violate a known law of physics. And so using the light year example, even if something was capable, it violates a law of physics to say that any particle with mass can travel at the speed of light. Photons and other subatomic particles that are capable of traveling at the speed of light do not contain mass. So say, okay, we won't posit that a known law of physics is violated. So let's say something like 80% of the speed of light. Okay, that doesn't violate a known law of physics, that some object could be traveling through space at that velocity. Even said that, realize how long it would take to traverse depending upon its orientation in the observable universe, knowing that if it takes 100,000 years for the speed of light to make it across just our galaxy, and there's however many trillion galaxies, like the Hubble Deep Space Field can show an example of this in terms of everything that looks like a star is a galaxy when you look at images of the Hubble Deep Space Field. So this kind of gives some food for thought that, man, given the number of objects such as a star that we refer to as our sun, and how many of those stars exist with planetary orbits, either in our own galaxy or the trillions of others that are suitable for what we determine to be necessary conditions for life in terms of pressures and temperatures, et cetera, that you're talking about trillions, numbers so vast in which you're just asking yourself the question, is it more or less likely given that number? And so that's why I think there's very compelling reasons to suggest that it's quite likely given the number. Now, on the other side of that, someone might argue, well, given a civilization approximate to our own or more advanced that has been emitting radio waves and all these other forms of analyzable and discoverable properties of physical law that are traveling across the universe, some at the speed of light, that we would have recognized some of that. We would have detected those already. Like we're detecting gravitational waves that are happening as far as ways they're happening. And therefore, if anything was happening in proximities in which we are receiving information from, then certainly within that same proximity, we could be receiving information from an intelligent form of life, which so far we have not. And so some people utilize a line of thinking in that direction that adds strength to the position that we're probably the only intelligent life. Which is my opinion is that I'm persuaded by the math that just based upon the number and understanding the evolutionary biological considerations that are necessary to produce intelligent life forms are extremely unique and complex. Well, we say unique as if we have knowledge of whether it's happening, elsewhere. It's an incredible situation that has, on the one hand, it's an incredible situation that has resulted in the way that it has here on Earth. And given that, I'm still inclined to lean towards something somewhat approximate to what we consider to be intelligent life somewhere else, just because of the size of this observable universe is who knows. But as to the multiverse, that's a whole, first of all, I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable to describe that and the opposing theories regarding the interpretations of quantum mechanics. However, if anybody is interested, it's important to recognize that while the mathematical predictions that are made by quantum mechanics are robust, and it explains why something like this is even possible, why the images can be communicated on the screen, the YouTube, and the sound, etc., they are made possible because of what physicists have understood about the mathematics of quantum mechanics. However, even though lasers and computers and the internet and all these technological advances owe their foundations to the understanding of the mathematics of quantum mechanics, there is yet to be an agreed interpretation of the theory. And the many universes theory, authored by Hugh Everett, is the one that physicists such as David Deutsch and others advocate for. And there are maybe a handful or more of different and opposing and conflicting theories, but I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable to expand upon those in the extent that I would view sufficient as a critic of myself.
Andrew, want to take us on out of here, buddy?
I will. My camera just died. It's amazing.
Uh-oh.
But wow, dude, I have so much reflecting to do. So I really appreciate this conversation. Shit was incredible. But if you guys are like me and you like this, please hit that like button and share it with somebody that needs to hear it. I'm sure there's a couple of us out there that are kind of on that pendulum that get a little bit too happy and then it swings back the other way. So that's something I need to keep in mind because I'm definitely in that camp. Follow the podcast at Mark Bell's Power Project on Instagram, at MB Power Project on TikTok and Twitter. My Instagram and Twitter is at I am Andrew Z, and at the Andrew Z on TikTok. Nsima, where are you at?
Nsima Inyang on Instagram and YouTube. Nsima Inyang on TikTok and Twitter. James?
I have a Twitter account at The Thinker Smith.
And what are you going to be doing with your consulting app that you've only pretty much given me access to? The rest of the world kind of needs this thing. So what can they do? They got to wait?
It's not definitive yet whether the application will be made available to the general public. I think we're leaning towards that. It was created to begin with corporate clients.
How can people contact you on that?
Hey guys, it's Andrew. I just wanted to make a quick correction. The email address that James gave out, his app is so brand new that it's not even active yet. So if anybody's interested in getting in contact with James regarding this consulting and even this consult app, just email James directly at james@novasend.com. So it's James, so JAMES at NOVASIND.com.
And apart from the email and Twitter, I thought it might be helpful to give a brief synopsis of how the organizational consulting works, which is through the company Novasend, and it is a tiered process in which I consult for the chief executive officer or chief decision maker, if that's not the CEO in a given organization, through a series of consults, most of which, particularly during the pandemic, have been done via Zoom. Once the series is complete, I then consult with the C-suite, which is the chief executive team or top executives if it's an organization that does not utilize a C-suite, for a series of consults that are group-oriented, also on video. Of course, it can also be in person as traveling restrictions are freed up. And then there's a technological solution, which we've mentioned a couple times in our discussion, which is the mobile application. And the mobile application was created for what started now as corporate clients, but there's also going to be a military special operations and law enforcement version tentatively. And the mobile application was created as the resource that scales. So no matter how large the organization is, the same content that I'm going over with the chief executive and the C-suite can now be delivered to everyone in the company via the mobile application. So in addition to scaling towards no matter how many employees there are, it is able to reinforce the interpersonal consulting that I'm doing with the CEO and the C-suite. And then in addition to that, there is another technological resource that my team has created for me. All of this technology, by the way, is fully proprietary, created in-house. My business partner has on contract a software development team that are former Microsoft executives that have done a fantastic job at developing the mobile application, which again, it's not presently accessible by the public, but we're giving serious thought to making it so. But in addition to the application, there's another technological resource that I've termed the Error Identification and Correction Forum. And what this is an online resource, same as the application, that fully encrypted, HIPAA certified, customizable for the client, in which this EIC, Error Identification and Correction Forum, is the solution to what inhibits the progress of most organizations, which is the inhibition of someone at some level of the organization either not having the access or the permission to solve problems elsewhere in the organization. So many organizations suffer from the failure to maximize talent that exists on the payroll. And logistically, it can be a problem for many organizations, particularly the larger that they are, to capture and cultivate the feedback of employees because of the logistics that are involved with allotting time and space and resources for physical meetings. And so what this forum allows for is a tremendous amount of operational advancement, because now anyone in the company has the ability to contribute to problem solving anywhere else in the company in which problems have been shared by department heads from those areas of the companies. There's a phenomenal advantage to operating in this way in terms of solving for a lot of the issues that currently plague, particularly the corporate environment. Issues rooted in race, gender, discrimination, religious, others, even if they're not obvious, but are the underlying explanations for why certain people advance slower than others or are not being paid the same as others. Because with this technological resource, everyone who contributes towards problem solving is able to be quantitatively, objectively tracked in terms of their contribution towards problems being solved. And so now, regardless of your race, your gender, your age, your religious preference, whatever else that might exist sort of in the background knowledge that biases people in positions to promote from making one decision versus another, now it's objective and quantifiable. And so this has the potential to revolutionize human resources problems and issues of advancement and promotion and salary and hiring and the rest. And it's essentially included in the package for the companies that enlist to roll out the mobile application. They go hand in hand, in that having gone through the mobile application, all of its content, you're that much more well equipped to be a user of the Error Identification and Correction Forum, named so because the only mode of progress, as we discussed, apart from accident, is the identification and correction of errors. And so that's a summary of the organizational aspect of Novosin.
There we go. I was asking James about the Matrix because he's a huge fan, and we're all pumped up about the new, the new Matrix that's coming up. Andrew, you were talking about the pendulum swinging. What James kind of explained to me, which was helpful, was that you're not necessarily just trying to keep everything just completely neutral, like that. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect, but maybe how far it swings, you know, can maybe be reduced. You know, and also in explaining maybe getting off balance a bit. Same thing, like maybe your band before was your emotions were really high and really low. Maybe before there was a lot of swings that people dealt with, that went high and low, and maybe over time you can work on kind of shrinking that down, so you're just kind of closer to being able to, as he was putting it, traverse your way back towards the middle.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and that's actually how I was kind of interpreting it.
Yeah, and I think everyone can do that, regardless of how far off they might think they are. I think everyone can shrink down their own version. They still, may be different than the next person. But strength is never a weakness. Weakness is never a strength. I'm at Mark Smelly Bell. Catch you guys later.